Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of Fort Ticonderoga's 25th Annual War College of the 7 Years' War, presented virtually using Zoom webinars. Your participation in this online program supports Fort Ticonderoga's mission to preserve, educate, and provoke an active discussion about the past and its importance to present and future generations. It is now my pleasure to introduce Beth Hill, President and CEO of Fort Ticonderoga. Good morning, Beth.
Good morning, Rich. Thank you so much for all of your work in making this program possible. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Fort Ticonderoga's 25th Annual War College of the 7 Years' War, a premier conference that we've been holding for the past 25 years, and we're delighted to welcome you today. Thank you to our longtime attendees. Many of you have been with us for all 25 years of this program, and thank you to our new friends who are joining us this year for the first time. A special thank you to our members and our donors. You make our work possible. Rich just cited our mission, and you make our work in preservation and education and fostering this ongoing discussion about the past possible. And truly this past year, you all and so many others across the nation have given us such an outpouring of your support. We are so grateful to you. Many of you last year enabled us to keep your registration fees when we were facing such a difficult time. Last year, certainly, at least in our lifetime, was unprecedented. And really last May, none of us truly knew what was going to happen. But I'm sure, like all of you, we found inspiration, comfort, and confidence in knowing the past and how it could guide us, and knowing that we are resilient and can truly overcome. In the early days of the pandemic, our team often thought about Bougainville's quote that he said in July of 1758, as the French forces were awaiting the British attack on Fort Carillon. He said, "Our situation is critical. Action and audacity are our sole resources." And truly, that is what our team did early on in the days of the pandemic. Our creative and nimble and hardworking team did what I call the pandemic pivot, and we launched our Center for Digital History. This program is part of that. The Center of Digital History reaches beyond the walls of the fort, beyond our epic 2,000-acre historic site, and reaches into the homes, the classrooms, and to all of our visitors, online visitors across America and beyond. I'm so happy to report that we're reaching schools from California to Alabama to Maine, all across the nation, even some Canadian schools, to share our history, and not only the history of Ticonderoga, but really what reflects our institution's mission from the early modern era, and looking at the broader Atlantic world and how it shaped ultimately the origin and evolution of our nation, and particularly through the lens of military history. And not just looking backwards, but what does it mean to us today, giving context today, because we believe so deeply in the importance of historical literacy and critical thinking. And we're so excited to engage visitors of all ages, from K through 12 to university students. Teacher education is such a critical part of our mission. To engage one teacher, we know we reach hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, and as well lifelong learners. And also, we offer so many wonderful entertaining programs. I'm sure many of you have enjoyed them over the past year. We also opened our gates to visitors last summer by the July 4th holiday, and interestingly enough, had more than 30,000 visitors come to Ticonderoga. We certainly had to alter how we operated and what we did and how we engaged to make our staff and visitors feel comfortable and safe. But truly, we felt like it was a public service to open these gates in this incredible place to inspire, to give hope, almost truly like a public service, to allow people to come here and have time together and enjoy and be inspired and appreciate the beauty of our site as well as the epic history. We opened our gates this year on May 1st. It was a snowy morning, but spring is well on its way here at Ticonderoga. We have so many wonderful programs planned this year. You saw in some of the previews, some of the highlighted special events, and we're just thrilled to be back to business as normal and excited to welcome our visitors from across the country and beyond. Our Center for Digital History will continue. This was part of our strategic plan to launch programs that engage people digitally. It's been a long time stakeholder request, and we really took the opportunity during the pandemic to launch it. So stay tuned for many, many, many other digital program opportunities. At the same time, we appreciate that coming to Ticonderoga and feeling the power of the place and being in person, which I think truly to all of us has such a different meaning. Feeling the energy and the organic conversations and learning together in person is so powerful. So we look forward to welcoming you to our site this year and to our future conferences in person. As an institution, we have also marched forward, even in this past very challenging year, with our longtime growth plans. The Pell home, the 1826 National Historic Landmark home that's on our property, that was part of the Pell estate. The Pell family were our museum founders and led the restoration of the fort in the early 20th century, built a home on our property in 1826. And William Ferris Pell was considered the earliest preservationist in America at that date when he put a fence around the fort ruins. So we have this beautiful home, $9 million restoration project that is nearing completion. It will open to the public in early August, and we look forward to those who will attend our seminar on the American Revolution in September, seeing the building. And please come and visit. It's a great multi-purpose facility. We also continue to march forward with a number of important projects in preservation and education. So I urge all of you to join our membership, get on our mailing list if you are not already, stay current with our many, many programs. We are here to enrich your lives and challenge you. And we're so very grateful to all of you for your support. And as Rich said at the beginning, your support enables our mission of preservation to preserve, educate, and provoke an active discussion of the past and its importance to present and future generations. And I'm sure you all agree with me, that mission is more important than ever today as we march forward as a people and a nation. So with tremendous gratitude, I thank you again for your support. I look forward to a wonderful conference. Thank you to the presenters for sharing your passion and your research and your knowledge with all the attendees. And we look forward to a wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Before we begin our program, I would like to orient those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom to how to get the most out of today's program. We are using Zoom webinar for today's program, meaning that both your microphone and camera are disabled during the program. If you'd like to ask questions of our speakers, you can use the Q&A button on the bottom menu bar to ask questions. I will be monitoring those throughout each program, and we will go through those questions, as many of those questions as we have time for at the end of each presentation. For best viewing, make sure you are in speaker view. There is a button in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom screen, and you select either speaker view or gallery view there. To make the speaker's PowerPoint larger on your screen, hover your cursor between the PowerPoint slide and the speaker's image. A tab will appear. If you click on the tab and pull it to the right, the PowerPoint image will become larger and the speaker's image smaller. Our program today runs until about 1 p.m. Tomorrow's program begins at 10 a.m. and concludes at about 12:30 p.m. We have 3 presentations today. Our first presenter this morning is Alexander Burns on Smashing the Clockwork Soldier, the infantryman's experience of battle in Europe and North America, 1740 to 1783. The idea that mid-18th century European infantrymen were inadaptable and inflexible is one of the most persistent myths regarding this era. This paper explores the ways in which soldiers deviated from tactical drill manuals in order to enter combat in rational and effective ways. Dr. Alexander Burns recently defended his dissertation at West Virginia University. His work focuses on the British and Prussian armies of the 18th century. He has published a number of articles and is the editor of a forthcoming My German's not good, Alex, but Festschrift for Christopher Duffy, a well-known 18th century military historian. Alex will be a lecturer in European and military history at West Virginia University during the 2021-2022 academic year. Good morning. Welcome, Alex, and thanks for throwing a German word my way.
Yes, you did wonderful, Rich. It's a delight to be talking to you all today. Although I'm not physically present at America's Fort, it's wonderful to be talking to a collection of folks who are committed to supporting this wonderful institution that preserves American history. So, Rich, have I shared my screen correctly? You can see it there.
Yes, you have. We can see it.
So today I want to talk about European armies, and primarily I will focus on their experience in Europe. Occasionally we'll reach over to the experience of battle in North America. But my goal today is to show the ways that European forces were flexible. And you can see in this image, this is actually an image from the American War of Independence, of two groups of Hessian soldiers in combat. And they're artistically depicted in the traditional rank and file of European armies. In the background of the image, you have soldiers in front, probably Jaeger, sort of rifled armed men fighting against the enemy who are sort of off in the distance in the image. And then you have the traditional solid formed troops of the line infantry behind these men. And so in my presentation today, I want to really focus on the ways in which our traditional image of rank and file soldiers and the way specifically infantry operated on the battlefield is not always accurate, and how we can better complicate that to gain a more perfect understanding of 18th century warfare. So 18th century soldiers have experienced a large attention from scholars in the last 40 years. We used to think that these men were sort of the put upon dregs of society, and now, as a result of a number of scholars and their research, we are beginning to change our social picture of the world of 18th century soldiers. But I think in the minds of the public and in the minds of military historians, the traditional narrative of 18th century warfare, that is soldiers marching in serried ranks, firing volleys of musketry on the battlefield, marching in step, often to the beating of drums, all of that has gone fairly unchallenged in our mental image of these soldiers in their world. And so while historians have focused greatly in the last 40 years on changing our social image, indicating that these men were maybe not the dregs of society, that their social lives were much more complex than the idea that the Duke of Wellington in the Napoleonic era says that they were the scum of the earth. That same scholarly revolution or scholarly intervention has not applied to the tactical world of battle. And so while my own dissertation focused on soldiers and their social experiences, I'm very interested and passionate about trying to understand the tactical world of the battlefield and the way that soldiers experience that in the 18th century. And so at the start, I think it's important to say, taking the words of a figure that hopefully are familiar to all of us from American history, George Washington, 18th century officers often preferred their men to obey orders in a rote or mechanical fashion. You can see here Washington describing the importance of military regulation. He says, without regulations and order, no service can be well conducted, and every service must be disagreeable, sluggish, and expensive, partaking more of the nature of militia than of the regularity of well-organized troops, which ought and may move like clockwork, where the component parts discharge their respective duties with propriety and exactness. So this gives you the view from above, if you will, from an 18th century army commander, that it would be better if soldiers did what they were told on the battlefield and followed the outlines of the drill and regulation to the letter and with exactness. This will allow for the greatest command and control and effectiveness on the battlefield. And while it's very natural, I think, that Washington would have this view, statements like this have kind of changed our perception or created a traditional perception of the way that 18th century battle was fought. And this perception filters down into many things. For one, we see it in film, that 18th century soldiers are almost like robots. And I've never tried this before, but here's a GIF from the Patriot of British soldiers sort of marching forward, and you can see they're kind of staring ahead with almost like a blank robotic look. And this perception of 18th century soldiers, that they are almost automata or robot-like in their movements, in the way that they respond to orders, this is a popular understanding in the minds of the public. And unfortunately, it's not just a popular understanding in the minds of the public, it has filtered into the way that historians write about this period. So here are some examples. William Wilcox says in his Age of Aristocracy, only an iron discipline could make troops out of such material. And here he gives the Duke of Wellington's quote that these men are the scum of the earth. An officer could not trust his men out of his sight for fear they would desert. This is a very traditional picture of the social hierarchy in armies, a military administrative view, that soldiers would desert at the first loud bang in the 18th century. They were not motivated beyond anything besides for maybe pay or drink. I think perhaps the most pressing statement is the one in the middle, though, by Manuel de Landa in his War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. Frederick the Great continued assembling the early army until its components became true automata, welded to their muskets, machines for whom individual marksmanship was irrelevant. And so you can see de Landa here has just full-on embraced the language of soldiers as robots or soldiers as machines who do not think for themselves on the battlefield, who do not engage in the rational analysis that is so common in the world of battle in our own time. And so statements like this are very common. They reinforce this public perception that soldiers in the 18th century were controlled by iron discipline, both on and off the battlefield. And so as a result, it maybe shouldn't surprise us that there has been a scholarly reaction to some portions of this this worldview or this way of analysis towards 18th century soldiers. Largely, this is the result of a British historian named Christopher Duffy, who began his scholarly work in the 1960s. He's still writing today. In fact, you can see Christopher sort of hamming it up there at a convention in South Bend, Indiana, in the lower right of the screen. But there's a selection of his titles up there on the image. Hopefully you're all familiar with Christopher, even just in passing. He taught at the British version of West Point, Sandhurst, their military academy, for many years, and continues to write on 18th century warfare today. But Christopher is not alone. There are a number of authors who, again, I'm sure will be familiar to many of our participants here today, who are pushing back against this notion that 18th century soldiers were sort of like the scum of the earth, trained by iron discipline to be robot-like in their way of fighting and sort of marching and military administrative work. So Stephen Brumwell in his book Redcoats, Matthew Spring in his book With Zeal and Bayonets Only have really challenged this common perception of the British Army in North America. I'd encourage you all to check out those works if you have not read them already. And then in Europe, perhaps that we're less familiar with as Americans, both Sasha Mubius and Ilya Berkovich have challenged the traditional view of 18th century soldiers in the continental armies of Europe, in the French army, the Prussian army, the Austrian army. And so these scholars, I would say broadly, are making the argument, and it's an argument that I'm going to present you today in the world of battle and tactics, that soldiers in the 18th century were more like modern soldiers, and there are broad continuities between the 18th century across the modern era in the 19th and 20th centuries, then there are radical differences. And this is a common assertion that there's a radical difference between soldiers in the 18th century and soldiers in the modern era. This assertion broadly comes back to the idea that the French Revolution completely changed modern society, and that there is a hard break between the world of the 18th century and the modern period. And while I think in some ways that's very true, this narrative or argument, broadly construed, has forced many historians to make inaccurate claims about the way that warfare fundamentally changed during the Napoleonic era, and soldiers became motivated by things like state patriotism and even maybe a sense of nationalism in that time. And I would say largely, Ilya Berkovich is making a strong argument against this, that there's strong evidence that soldiers are motivated by home and attachment to place and family, and even the beginnings of state patriotism in the 18th century before the French Revolution. So all of this hopefully gives you a scholarly background, what historians would call the historiography of this topic. Broadly, there are scholars arguing that 18th century soldiers were low-class men that needed to be strictly controlled, and there are scholars arguing that broadly 18th century soldiers were more like modern soldiers than we might previously have thought. So let's see what this might mean on the battlefield. There are tactical myths, I think, that accompany this thesis about whether or not 18th century soldiers were modern. You can see here, of course, a famous painting of the British as they attack Bunker Hill, where they're robot-like, marching in serried ranks forward, even in face of their own destruction. And this, I would say, broadly, is the tactical myth that underpins a lot of popular understandings of 18th century warfare, that soldiers didn't aim. The idea that soldiers were told to level their muskets and individual marksmanship was not something that 18th century officers or soldiers really cared about at all. That soldiers only fired in volleys and would never fire independently, because the argument goes, after all, how can you aim if you're being ordered to fire at a specific time by an officer? That men were too dumb to take cover. And this is flippant, but it comes from an article title in the 1990s. The article title is "Too Dumb to Take Cover?" ? Essentially the narrative goes, despite the increasing destruction of firepower in the 18th century, soldiers did not attempt to preserve themselves and simply stood in their ranks and were shot down. And then finally, that soldiers, as you can see in the painting here, only marched to the beating of drums, slowly maneuvering across the battlefield. So in the remainder of the time that I have here today, I'm going to try and address and hopefully complicate some of these traditional views of 18th century soldiers on the battlefield. First of all, let's talk a little bit about aiming. These are from the Prussian infantry regulations of 1750. And I use the Prussian case because often if there is one army that scholars argue is a robotic army, it is the Prussian army. The perception is that the Prussian army under Frederick II or Frederick the Great of Prussia was a draconian institution that beat its men into service, that to use the famous and often misused phrase of Frederick the Great, that soldiers should fear their officers more than the enemy. So the Prussians, I think, can help us stand in for these more broad perceptions across all of 18th century European armies. But here in the regulations of the Prussian infantry, the officers must take care that the men stand firm upon their ground before they give the word present. They level well and take good aim without any hurry. And then later, just before that, the men must take a good aim and look boldly into their fires. They shouldn't be looking away from their muskets as they're shooting. They should look boldly into their fire. The officers are to be careful to make them level straight, the musket butt must rest even with the shoulders, and the men sink their heads down a little in order to take better aim. Indeed, as we've looked at in the world of material culture in the past few years, there's often a claim made that muskets have no sights, and indeed, if you look at the Prussian musket, it does have a sight on the front, not a bayonet lug, but an actual sight on the front of the musket. And so here in the 1750s, in a relatively draconian army that relies, on discipline to make its men fight, aiming is important to the Prussian soldier and the Prussian officer. Obviously, in North America with the British Army, this is a very common practice as well. We have reports of British troops firing at marks in 1758 as they prepare to attack the fortress of Louisbourg. We have descriptions from officers that the men are taking a very good aim. And then finally, later during the American War of Independence, you see army-wide orders on the part of German troops who have come to North America, Braunschweigers who've come to North America in order to fight against the colonial rebels, that the men are to make targets and practice target shooting. And then this passage goes on, I don't have it fully reproduced here, to say that the best shots in each company will be given a financial reward. And so marksmanship is indeed something that soldiers prized, and it doesn't just come about because of the keen-eyed riflemen in the War of Independence. It's something that soldiers prized throughout the 18th century, from the 1740s onward. Now, again, another myth, the second one that we mentioned, is that soldiers in the 18th century often fired volleys, in volleys. In fact, we think about in European warfare the complicated alternate firing systems of firing by platoons, or an eighth of the battalion firing at a specific time, or firing by divisions or grand divisions, where a 16th or a fourth of the battalion might fire at any one time. Historians have written a lot about the differences in these various alternate firing systems, but it's important to note that they were rarely used in practice. You have here reports from British officers during the Jacobite Rebellion. I shall add, the fire of our foot was infamous. Puff, puff, and it's almost like he's a guy going to the mechanic trying to make the sound that his car is making. He's trying to describe the sound of sort of running fire, men loading and firing as fast as they can. No platoon firing that I heard, although I've heard others in the action say near the right they heard 2 firings by platoon. And then this is the second quote, a officer in the War of Austrian Succession, who, as a general is riding by on the battlefield, he says, well, how should we engage the enemy? Which complicated alternate firing system should we use? And the general officer replies, as to platoon or rank firing, I should be glad to see you perform either in action, but I own I never did yet on a field, only at a field day or at a review. So here he says, if you can convince the men to fire by platoons on the battlefield, that's great, but I've never seen it done in actual combat before. This is a fairly well-known quote that comes from the writings of a British officer after the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. And it's a long quote, but basically the gist of it is that the officer is communicating, our soldiers are not firing by platoons. Maybe they were able to do it once. But after that, they are all making a running fire. That is, they're loading and firing as fast as they can. And they're stooping low to the ground. And we'll come back to this point later. And then when they fire, they might stand up fully and fire and then stoop back low to the ground. And the French and the Austrians are all doing the same thing. And then at the end, I think is perhaps the most striking bit, like running fires without waiting for words of command, and that Lord Stair did often say that he had seen many a battle and never saw the infantry engage in any other manner, is true. So here you have a more experienced officer, comment to a junior officer, don't be surprised that this is happening. This happens frequently when soldiers engage one another in actual combat. And here from the end of the century, this is a text written in the 1790s by the Saxon military theorist Johann Gottfried Hoyer. And Hoyer says, in fact, in all these types of firing were practiced in peacetime on the drill square. That is to say, platoon firing, firing by ranks, firing by divisions. But soldiers hardly used them in serious combat. Once there, everything was abandoned for running fire, in German, Plackerfeuer. That is to say, everyone loaded and shot for himself as fast as he could. This is highly embarrassing from the perspective of an officer now, he's writing. As after 100 years of practice, we cannot bring common soldiers uncontrolled and build an unfeeling shooting machine. And that emphasis is mine there in the text. So here he says, we would like to, officers would like to create some sort of robotic automata that only reacts when we give it orders and only sort of marches where we want it to go and fires when we want it to fire. But that's not the case. In the heat and confusion of battle, the instrument, and when he says the instrument, he's talking about the battalions of men, is only set in motion by the artist's finger. And again, the artist is the officer. Some exceptions to the general rule of running fire, which may be found among the Prussian troops and them alone, have been made possible through their ceaseless practice. They can prove nothing against the universality of the idea shared here. So all this to say, volley firing, firing by platoons, it's an important part of 18th century soldier training. Soldiers might be able to perform it once on the battlefield, but frequently this type of complicated firing or alternate fire system breaks down in practice. So moving on to trying to preserve yourself from enemy fire on these battlefields of the 18th century. So this is the Comte de Guibert in his general essay on tactics. He's writing about the way to organize your men when they give fire. First of all, I disagree with allowing the first rank to kneel at the battles of Parma and Gustula during the War of Polish Succession in the 1730s. All of our infantry and the Austrians fought in this manner. And another quote, which I didn't include for the interest of time, Charles Emmanuel de Warnery, a Prussian cavalry officer commenting on these same battles, says they fought using the Croatan art, or in the manner of the Croatian troops, crawling like snakes on their bellies. And so you have whole battalions of men, essentially, who are either kneeling or laying low to the ground and firing at each other. And perhaps again, this explains the quote we saw earlier, where the British troops at the Battle of Dettingen are stooping low to the ground. The second quote here is from the relation of Samson Staniforth, who eventually becomes a Methodist minister, but in the War of Austrian Succession was a common soldier in the British Army. Here he's talking about the Battle of Fontenoy. We marched up boldly, but we came close to the town of Fontenoy. A large battery was ready to open fire on us. We had orders to lie down on the ground, but for all that, many were killed. Many were wounded, some were killed. Presently, after the discharge, we rose up and still keeping up our fire, he adds. So here you have the officers acknowledging that in the face of a battery of heavy cannon just ready to discharge anti-personnel munitions, you should lie down and try to avoid getting hit by this weapon. Likewise, in the 1740s and 50s, we see more examples of troops lying down in a tactical situation. Again, from the battle in the War of Austrian Succession, Sir Robert ordered the whole regiment to clap to the ground, as to throw themselves on the ground, on receiving the French fire, and instantly, as soon as it was discharged, they sprung up, coming close to the enemy, and poured their shot upon them. So you have here an alternate system of taking cover and then opening fire. And this is something that, as Matthew Spring has shown, we see in the British Army, even say during the American War of Independence. And it's not every regiment, and different regimental cultures answer this question in different ways. But certainly some officers did want their men to sort of avoid the enemy's fire and preserve their lives. Likewise, you have another comment here. This is from the sort of famous diarist Corporal Todd. And as soon as we got ashore during a descent on the French coast in the 7 Years' War, we lay down upon the beach near the water's edge that our ships might fire over us in case the enemy advanced to make any attack upon us. So here you have a beach landing, troops spilling out of the longboats and laying on the ground to permit naval artillery to support them from range. Again, a common perception here is that troops in the 18th century world of battle only march slowly, as in that image in the Battle of Bunker Hill, that they, to the beating of drums, sort of robotically marched forward and accept their destruction. And that's, again, not always the case. From the War of Polish Succession, you have a French officer commenting, the Picardy Brigade ran almost as in a race when it was sort of called to reinforce embattled sections of the line. The quickest arrived first. And then the second quote, you have a Prussian, an anonymous Prussian author from the collection, the Sammlung ungedruckte Nachrichten, or the collect unpublished reports. And here you have him describing the Battle of Prague in 1757, where a group of Prussian soldiers, a battalion of Prussian Fusiliers, is running past a village. And as soon as he says that, there's the comment, regiment was not in perfect order. He's a little bit sheepish about this. And he also notes the Austrians were advancing on us at the quick step. Johann Jakob Dominicus, a Prussian musketeer from the 7 Years' War, likewise notes at the Battle of Zorndorf, I believe, in 1758. Our left wing had its work cut out for us. We had to run with energy in order to get under the enemy guns. So here, as opposed to lying down when sort of targeted by enemy artillery, the Prussians are quickly moving through the field of fire to try and get to a place of safety. And then finally, describing Prussian reviews in the 1780s, you have David Dundas, quick movements with considerable lines and columns of infantry. Frederick II considers impractical or ruinous from the hurry or disorder that must thence ensue, but smaller divisions of the line occasionally lengthen their step and move on with rapidity at the moment of attack. So broadly, he's saying, you don't want to have your entire army running, hither and yon about the battlefields, but in certain circumstances, you might want a battalion of men to run quickly in order to, be where they need to be at the right time at a specific moment in the battle. So, kind of putting forth some conclusions here. The idea of mechanical or clockwork soldiers is harmful when attempting to access the reality of 18th century battle. So, as hopefully some of these quotes have made clear, the world of 18th century battle was one where common soldiers, they didn't simply march robotically into fire without caring whether or not they were shot. Men attempted to take cover. Men attempted to sort of get out of the way of enemy fire. They moved quickly in order to arrive on time and prevent gaps from opening in the battle lines. Soldiers did not simply stand there with loaded muskets waiting for the command to fire. They, and Christopher Duffy talks about this in terms of a psychological need to fire. As soon as you load, you want to do damage to the enemy in order to sort of shorten the battle or at least get through the firefight as quick as you can. A Prussian diarist, Ulrich Bracher, says that in great heat and excitement at the Battle of Laubositz in 1756, he fired through his entire ammunition load of 60 shots. Almost like he was in a trance. So the world of battle in the 18th century was one that presented soldiers with psychological demands and was difficult to pass through. I mean, it was, I would say, as psychologically demanding as Napoleonic warfare, and this made the soldiers act in ways that frustrated their officers, but psychologically made sense to the men. In this way, facing artillery firing anti-personnel munitions or heavy enemy infantry fire, 18th century soldiers confronted and endured battlefield conditions similar to those of soldiers throughout the modern period. And I'm not saying that the world of battle in the 18th century is comparable to the world of battle in World War II, but I do think there are broad continuities in experiencing enemy fire that psychologically produce similar responses. And this is something that actually Sasha Mobius has recently addressed in the 7 Years' War. So as we examine soldiers in the 18th century, we should not simply assume that they are familiar and understandable, but we should also not assume that they're completely foreign. Instead, we should carefully historicize the experiences of these men to try and draw broad parallels between their experiences and ones that say we might be more familiar with or have more access to, such as the experience of fire that men went through in the Second World War, the First World War, the Napoleonic era. With that said, I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. You can see my contact information there on the slide. I would love to answer any questions that you don't ask, but have via email if you'd like to write to me later on.
Thank you, Alex. We do have questions for you. I think when you talk about provoking an active discussion, you've done very well for us this morning. First question is, I would love to hear a little bit more about your work with Professor Christopher Duffy. Is it regarding siege warfare? And is it an adjunct to Professor Duffy's classic Fire and Stone?
So no, a Festschrift is a collection of essays that all are dedicated to honor a particular recipient. It's a German term. I mean, we might call it a celebration of scholarship in English. I should say, if you're interested in siege warfare, Dr. Duffy is currently working on a book on Napoleonic sieges. This is a passion project of his for many years. He's still sort of working away on it. When I was over at Kew doing research for my dissertation, he had me scan a few objects that he was going to use in that project. I would say keep an eye out for that. If you'd like to send me an email, I'd be happy to sort of discuss that a bit more with you. But Christopher is very interested in siege warfare and is carrying that interest on a little bit further into European history.
Okay, we have a two-part question. The second part I'm going to read first so I don't forget it because it's not adjacent. But where can I find an English translation of the Prussian infantry regulations you refer to? Right. And then the more.
So I won't dig through my bookshelf here, but if you just look on Amazon, if you type in regulations of the Prussian infantry translated by William Fawcett, it'll come up. It was translated actually in the period, and you can also, I think, find the translation for free on Google Books because it's out of copyright. And again, if you want specific links, feel free, send me an email. I'd be delighted to give you those links so you can find exactly what you're looking for.
Okay, the other part of that question, Hessian-style arms of the American Revolution are often marked with the abbreviation NO period. Writers about the era differ on whether the abbreviation indicates the English number or the German North, as in Nord. Some antiquarians have suggested that all continental arms were marked with French abbreviations. Can you comment on the proper interpretation of these abbreviations?
So I should say this is not my specific field of research, but broadly, muskets in the 18th century are marked with maybe not regimental, but like company level and soldier identifying numbers. And so you issued a soldier or rack number when you enter the British Army, and as a result, they'll stamp that on the wrist of the musket. I don't know that I'm allowed to do this, but if you want to get in contact with Matt Cagle, I'm confident that he could give you a specific answer to this question. Matt is the living authority on material culture in 18th century armies. I've never seen any indication that Hessian muskets were marked with a abbreviation for North. But I think Matt would be able to answer that question better than I was.
Okay, and I know Matt is with us today, so Matt, you can text me if you have an answer to that. Next question: did the motivations or intelligence of soldiers vary significantly by the quality of the unit? For example, did elite units tend to have men more motivated by a sense of place or independence of thinking?
So it kind of depends on the army, and I would say my gut reaction is no. Just looking at the Prussian case, probably the army that I'm most familiar with, it's actually the guard regiments that are composed of sort of the most foreign, I won't say mercenaries because I think that's a bad term, but men who've been recruited in foreign locales and are serving for pay in Prussia. There are a higher number of these sort of foreign recruits in the elite guard regiment, Regiment 15, than in any of the other regiments of the army, which are by and large recruited locally from sort of canton districts in Prussia. So, well, I don't think that's the case necessarily across European armies as a whole. I would say that elite troops are often just a reflection of the army that they are a part of. So it is possible to be transferred as a soldier from a musketeer company to a grenadier company, and they don't really take into account where exactly you come from when you do this. Now, I would say in many armies, there is an idea that troops from particular regions are more elite than others. For example, in the Prussian army, troops from like Pomerania and Pomerelia are viewed as being some of the best in the army as a whole. And so there, I would say, maybe it's the reverse of your question, that a regional identity provides a sense of eliteness, or at least a perception of eliteness in the mind of the king.
Another two-part question. The first part is, how did tactics evolve as artillery became increasingly effective? And then the second part, what was the state of the art with respect to combined arms tactics, infantry, cavalry, artillery operating in combination? Too complicated to give limitations in communications? And I can repeat any part of that you need me to.
No, it's all right, Matt. Or it's all right, Rich. Thank you so much. So I will say, there's a lot of combined armed warfare in the 18th century. And if you look at the rise of an institution the Europeans called the Legion, and I mean, we call it here that here as well. It's a small combined arms formation that contains often line infantry, artillery, some light cavalry, and or maybe even dragoons, and then sometimes marksmen or riflemen. And the Prussians, the French, Austrians, they all kind of use these combined arm formations in the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. They're so successful that when the Freiherr von Steuben or Baron de Steuben comes to North America to train the Continental Army, this is one of the suggestions that he really kind of spends a lot of time arguing with Congress about. He's like, we need more legions in America. And it makes sense because he was in a combined arms unit like this in Europe. He was in the Freibattalion von Meer, I want to say. And so he's trying to bring his experience as a combined arms officer to bear in North America. And actually wrote a paper about this for the last consortium of the Revolutionary Era. How do tactics evolve as artillery becomes increasingly effective, I think is a very important question. It leaves almost like a psychological scar in the mind of Frederick the Great. Great battles like Torgau in 1760, where the Prussian infantry are just slaughtered by a mass battery of like 300 Austrian cannon. But at the end of the 7 Years' War, he's like, well, we really need to kind of change our thinking and invest more heavily in our artillery, stop costly infantry attacks, and as a result, you have his strategy going into the War of Bavarian Succession, which runs concurrently with our American War of Independence. And there, it's very much a positional conflict. Both armies have essentially fortified camps set up with loads of large and heavy cannon, and as a result, there's not a great deal of dynamic tactics going on. And I think, honestly, this transition at the very end of the old regime towards a more static positional warfare is what might give the perception in the minds of Napoleonic scholars that the Ancien regime armies were slow and old-fashioned and things like this. So it's a very good question.
Alex, we have a limited amount of time left. I'm going to try to combine three different people's questions. So hopefully I make it sound okay.
Okay.
One refers to balancing the evidence between independent firing and the concept of mass firepower. How does your research raise questions about the supposed perfect volley at the Plains of Abraham?
Sure.
And would you agree that the rate of fire was the determining factor for battlefield tactics? How much firepower could be laid down and how quickly determines the tactical adjustments that you described?
Right. No, very good. So here's what I'll say. The kind of opening volley of an engagement, where the troops fire for the first time, is really a very precious resource, especially considering the psychological demands and breakdown in alternate fire systems that I've just described. Right. So at the Plains of Abraham, if you are able to get in close and fire a fresh volley, and there's a book on this by David Blackmore, I want to say, where he talks about the sort of British firepower tactic is to hold fire until the enemy is in very close range, and then fire and use that sort of destructive first volley. I do think that when you're able to do that, it works very well. Doing that is sort of approaching the enemy without firing. It is a very psychologically demanding thing for soldiers, because if you're getting hit by enemy artillery or musket fire, really the only psychological response the soldiers have is to contribute to the battle in their mind, is to fire back. So I think that's why you see some of the challenges in officers' debate, the all-important question of when to open fire, because once you fire, and this is a paraphrased quote from Georg Barenhorst, who eventually becomes a Napoleonic sort of writer, but it begins his career in the old regime. You can sort of control the outset of the engagement, but once the men really start loading and firing, things are going to break down very quickly. And then he literally says you have to sort of wait for the whole mass to either go forward or backward once they're really engaged. So officers can execute a lot of control or direct a lot of control on their men at the beginning of engagements. But once you are, say, locked into a firefight with an enemy battalion that's like 120 yards away, your men are probably going to focus on doing that and not be responsive to a lot of your different commands.
Alex, I have two different questions about Bunker Hill, but
excellent.
I guess the gist of it is, why were the casualties so high, and how characteristic of the British Army are the results of what happened to the British at Bunker Hill?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. The British casualties are so high at Bunker Hill because at Bunker Hill the British are not using a lot of the tactical adaptations that they're sort of famous for now in the rest of the American War of Independence. So the attacks launched at Bunker Hill are fairly unimaginative. They don't succeed in sort of the first push driving the rebel forces from their position, and so the British forces suffer a lot of casualties as a result. Not as a result of that, but because sort of Lord Howe comes into command, and I mean it's not just Howe, but also sort of officers up in Canada who are sort of doing the same thing. You have the British kind of readapt to their mindset that they embraced during the French and Indian War. That is a kind of not a response to Bunker Hill, but at Bunker Hill the British are not yet doing that. So as a result, I would characterize the fighting by the British at Bunker Hill as more of this sort of traditional view than most of the battles of the American Revolution, and it's probably maybe why that stands so close in our memory. It's an example of an attack where the British are fighting in a fairly traditional manner. By 1776, the British are spaced out in open order and jogging into the attack with bayonets. They are not trying to engage us in firefights. And so, as a result, they have a lot more success because we're not prepared to fight them as much in that way.
Thank you, Alex. A very quick question. Is your thesis available online?
It is. Yeah. And if you send me an email, I can send you a link to that.
And the last question might be a little bit out of your wheelhouse. It relates to the American Civil War.
Very good. Okay.
Some battles of the American Civil War, Malvern Hill, Pickett's Charge, Cold Harbor, are portrayed as lines of infantry marching to doom. Are those portrayals correct? And what was going on in the mind of the commanders who ordered those attacks?
Yeah. So I'll try to answer this briefly. You should, if you've not already, and you probably have based on this question, you should look at Earl J. Hess's work on the American Civil War. I want to say his book is called The Rifled Musket in the Civil War or something like that. But it provides, I think, an interesting answer to your question. Large infantry attacks are made for a variety of reasons. I'll actually answer with one from the Battle of Fredericksburg in when the Union Army is sort of attacking Marie's Heights. There, it's very common for us today to criticize Burnside for making these sort of, in our mind, kind of almost suicidal frontal attacks on a strong Confederate position. And this is sort of like the surface level understanding of the battle. What's actually going on there is Burnside realizes that he has sort of the shattered remains of sort of the initial wave of attack down, sort of taking cover in the swale, and he does not want the Confederates to launch a counterattack off of that high ground. So he continues the attacks to sort of keep pressure on them. So by and large, I mean, there are mistakes made. Sherman at Kennesaw Mountain, and I would say probably Grant at Cold Harbor are not, they don't look at those attacks as being particularly successful. But often when these attacks are initially ordered, there is sort of rational reasons for it in the mind of the commander. I don't, as far as whether the men are just sort of marching slowly to their doom, I think I'd be probably pretty skeptical about that. Soldiers in the Civil War are not robots any more than soldiers in the 18th century. But again, I would say check out the works of Earl J. Hess if you've not already, and that might give some help as to why the rifled musket is maybe not the incredibly technological answer that makes these attacks obsolete that we used to think it was.
Okay, thank you, Alex, and thank you everybody for your questions. We're going to take a brief break. We're going to resume at 11:05. That's 8 minutes from now. So you can get a second cup of coffee. Unfortunately, we can't give you those famous War College donuts this morning, but hopefully you've got something to snack on, grab, and we will resume again at 11:05. And Jason, if you want to go ahead, we'll turn off Alex's screen. And if you want to go ahead and boot up your screen so we're ready to go at 11:05. Thanks again, Alex.
Thanks so much. It's been an incredible honor to be here with you all this morning.
Okay, we're back and we're ready for our next session. Um, Briefly, Alex mentioned one of the European academics, Stephen Brumwell, in his talk, and I just wanted to let everyone know that Stephen Brumwell will be our keynote speaker at our seminar on the American Revolution this September, September 24th through 26th, which is scheduled to take place in person at Fort Ticonderoga. The brochure for that seminar is due in from the printer early next week. So expect a brochure in the mail in the next week or so with all the details about that seminar. We've also had a question about the recordings. We are recording each session each day. There'll be separate YouTube videos, and once the editing is done on those videos, I'll be sending out an email to all our participants that'll have the links to each of the 3 days recordings, and that email will also have the email contact for all of our presenters. So for those of you who are scurriedly trying to write down different email addresses, if you don't get that done, I will be sending those out probably Wednesday or Thursday next week once the editing's been done on those videos. Fort Ticonderoga would like to thank all of you for joining us this weekend, and we especially appreciate our patrons, Reed Boyd and Don Weiss. We also would like to thank all of you who donated your registration fees last year when we were forced to postpone the War College, as well as those of you who rolled over your registration to this year's program. Our second presentation this morning is William Trent and the Fort St. George by Jason Cherry. In the year 1754, before a young George Washington would set the world on fire in the Glen or build the thing upon the meadows, trader William Trent and his hired volunteers would begin an outpost at the forks of the Ohio in the spring of 1754 that would not only lay the foundation for the conflict known as the 7 Years' War, but also begin the early remnants of the city we know today as Pittsburgh. Jason Cherry is a historical interpreter, independent researcher, resident author of the William Trent House in Trenton, New Jersey, and author of the newly published Pittsburgh's Lost Outpost, Captain Trent's Fort. Good morning and welcome, Jason.
Hi, thanks, Rich. Yeah, hello, everyone. Thanks for everyone that's tuned in today and in attendance and help keep history alive here. Let us begin saying that 1754 was a giant race between two world powers that were simultaneously ready to hit head on. We have the French in the north, in Canada or New France. And then you have towards the south, the English, but most specifically the colony of Virginia, whose Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, was a prominent, coincidentally, a prominent landholder and shareholder in a large speculating land company known as the Ohio Company. This company, made up of Marylanders, Virginians, and even London merchants, both were influential, or all three were influential in helping, or at least aiding and abetting Robert Dinwiddie into eyeing up the Ohio Valley, or known by most people that traveled there, the Ohio Country, and set their sights basically on modern day West Virginia, modern day Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and what we know today is the state of Virginia. And their finish line, so to speak, between France and England was, of course, a triangular piece of land where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers would join to form the Ohio River. Known then as the Forks of the Ohio, it became what we know today as the site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was Dinwiddie, Robert Dinwiddie here, the governor of Virginia, that would actually elect or select William Trent, a backcountry merchant, former soldier, to be the supervisor commander of such a mission to hopefully build the first English outpost at the forks of the Ohio, or in the Ohio Country. And in this service, let us begin with talking about who William Trent was. There we go. We have, so William Trent was born, we're not exactly sure when his birth was. Doing my research, I've narrowed it down pretty much in the early 1720s, between basically 1721 and 1722. He stood about 6'1", mainly because I base it on this particular piece of clothing that you see here before you. This vest or waistcoat made of silk is found at the William Trent Museum in Trenton, New Jersey. William Trent Jr., who we're talking about right here, was the son of William Trent. His father, who was a judge in not only New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and was also the basically namesake for where they named Trenton, New Jersey. And in fact, if you visit today, Trenton, New Jersey, you can actually go to the original William Trent House where William Trent grew up as a boy, and where his father had built and completed in the fall of 1721 in Trenton, New Jersey. So Trent was able, with these connections from his father, who was a well-known merchant in Philadelphia and also Trenton, to be educated and apprenticed under his cousin and merchant Edward Shippen III. As far as the Shippen family was very prominent in Philadelphia, was in fact one of the founders with William Penn as far as getting a government. Edward Shippen I, which was the grandfather of the person that would apprentice Trent, was the first mayor of Philadelphia. So as the sort of Pennsylvania was shaping itself, the Shippens were at the head on of all of this with the Penn family. So Trent would eventually learn French, Latin, would learn arithmetic and grammar. This is an example of the exact book or a replica of the exact book that Trent would study on, an introduction to Latin. Whereas under Shippen, he would eventually work out of Shippen's house there on 2nd Street. Actually would be today in Philadelphia, right near what we know today is City Tavern in Philadelphia. And would also work out of his store, which was on Carpenter's Wharf, a store, basically storefronts that lined up the gigantic waterfront at the time in Philadelphia along the Delaware River. And he would keep account books, knowing full well with this arithmetic and Latin, would not only keep account books for Edward Shippen, but also pen deeds and such at his frontier depot that he began building as the fur trade started to pick up in the early 1740s there in Shippensburg. So as William Trent became prominent handling the account books, another fellow apprentice with William Trent, under Edward Shippen, was by the name of Hugh Parker. And Hugh Parker became actually the first factor of this land agency I just mentioned called the Ohio Company. And what Hugh Parker would do would actually supply and handle all the account books for the Ohio Company as they were looking to hopefully build Outpost and also settle in what we know in the Ohio country, or what we know today is modern day West Virginia, and of course closer, which sort of had the control of the whole Ohio River Valley, the forks of the Ohio, or what we know today as modern Pittsburgh. So as Hugh Parker would die, they would find another fellow apprentice, William Trent, who would become not only the factor, and he would become this in 1752, which was why he was the front runner to be the supervisor of this English outpost that Virginia wished to build, hopefully, on the forks of the Ohio. And Trent would move to this. You see this picture of what they call the New Store Tract. Today, this is Ridgely, West Virginia. This is looking from the city of Cumberland, Maryland, but it's directly across that blue bridge that you see. Where the Ohio Company would have their main headquarters. A warehouse was built so they could use to supply, built by Trent's former apprentice, Hugh Parker. And Trent would act out of this place here because this was Frederick County, Virginia at the time period in the 1750s. And from this warehouse, that would be their main operations to hopefully proceed to the forks of the Ohio. And as Trent, in addition to many duties that he carried, he would build, only help with the supplying the warehouse and getting ready for such an expedition, But he also acted as a district justice there in Winchester, Virginia, in Frederick County, Virginia, being that he had a house there where you see in that modern day picture. So, as I was saying, the sort of southern part with the English moving north here to hopefully settle in the Ohio Valley, the French also eyed this. And by the summer of 1753, got a sort of jump on the English, so to speak, in this somewhat global race here in modern day western Pennsylvania. And the French had already built 2 forts by the summer and also a supply depot. And I'll bring it up here. The first one was Fort Presque Isle, where modern day Erie, Pennsylvania is. Fort LeBoeuf in modern day Waterford, Pennsylvania. And then their supply depot, they would build in what would be known as Venango at a former fur trader's house of John Fraser, who at the time was forced out of his house and had fled from Venango later to build a house at the mouth of Turtle Creek, about 8 miles or so on the Monongahela from the future site of Pittsburgh. And at this time, the French also eyed their next spots because they were building a chain of forts, hopefully from Lake Erie, that they could supply the whole way down the Allegheny River, or at what it was known then as the Ohio River. And the French would eventually set sail, hopefully, to go down the Ohio or Allegheny River to hopefully build another outpost at what was then Logstown, or where Economy, Pennsylvania, about 18 miles below the future site of Pittsburgh. And then eventually a sort of 5th outpost at the mouth of Beaver Creek. Today, it's the small town of Rochester, Pennsylvania. And at this time, this is where the French were looking to build. This map here, of course, is the 1754 map drawn by young Major George Washington when he trekked north to visit these French that were at these outposts here at Fort LeBoeuf. So Trent, after getting orders from Dinwiddie, would eventually realize that it was a long way from the Ohio Company warehouse there in Frederick County, Virginia. Today speaking, the modern day travel time, traveling from Ridgely, West Virginia, which is what it's known today, where the Ohio Company warehouse would be, to Pittsburgh is almost around 120 miles. Back then, numerous itinerants that would travel this route would say it was about 130 miles, dealing with the Indian paths and such that would go that way. So Trent realized it was a long way to get to the forks of the Ohio. So he would eventually arrive at what he deemed the most place suitable and navigable by waters to get to the forks of the Ohio. That would sort of cut the time in half and use it as a supply depot eventually till they build their fort. And this fort was known as, or this outpost or storehouse that he would end up building would be at with the mouth of Redstone Creek that ran into the Monongahela, also known today as Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And these men that he hired from the Ohio Company would build a storehouse, and they would use this until they received further orders. Now, at that time, Trent would start building there, and like I said, January, he would arrive there on January 30 of 1754, but wouldn't receive his commission until February 10th, 1754, to officially have orders to move to the forks of the Ohio and start building a fort. He, along with another young up-and-coming person named George Washington, who was assigned to also find 100 men to hopefully join and guard the workmen that Trent was going with as he's heading to the forks of the Ohio to finally to build. And at this time, as the French force is beginning their supposed outpost and supplying them with soldiers, they decide that they are going to start their journey as well. They left Quebec there on January 15th in 1754, and this is the force that would eventually start making their way, joining more soldiers at each of these outposts I mentioned earlier. And as the French would join, they would begin their journey, hopefully moving to the Ohio country and the forks of the Ohio. So at the Redstone, after receiving the orders at Redstone Creek, Trent eventually gets 2 blank commissions. One he gives to the former a resident of the house that they use as supply, the French use as a supply depot now in Venango, named John Fraser, who he makes his lieutenant. And he delivers a commission to, as an ensign, to Edward Ward, the half-brother of another infamous trader of the time named George Crowan. And it was at Fraser's cabin that they wait, about 8 miles from the future site of Pittsburgh or Forks of the Ohio. And they await word from the most important influential figure in this building of this outpost. And his name is the Half King, or Tannerison. And the Half King, Trent knows that it's the Half King's permission and the Six Nations permission that they need to in order to build an outpost at the Forks. So at this time they wait. And as they do so, Trent decides to offer a sort of bonus for joining up with him as volunteers to build this Forks of the Ohio. And he promises 2 shillings a day, 3 times the rate that Washington is actually charging to get his Virginia regiment soldiers. So at this time, Trent's getting more volunteers joining him as he waits word on the Half King. So once they do receive word that the Half King to meet him at the Forks of the Ohio, they travel the 8 miles, arrive there on officially February 17, 1754. And it's estimated on Trent by a letter that he had about 70, even close to 80 men by the time they began work on the fort. Now, in his eventual manuscripts that he would write later, and pretty much the only other known accounts by Ensign Edward Ward, a deposition he would write in 1754 and 56, they both agreed in their accounts that it was the Half King that laid the first log. And Trent knew that the Half King only would allow this fort to be built if they could use it as well. And so as the Half King laid the first log, Trent would write it was the first log for one of their storehouses. Now, originally in the numerous accounts, and just to give you an idea as you think of this, this is the sort of a great depiction by a renowned artist, Robert Griffin, who this is called Half King at Trent at the Forks. And this is the Monongahela side, or if you're looking from this side today, if you're familiar with the city of Pittsburgh and Point State Park, this is the high embankments to where the trees you see above there would in fact be where the fountain is today in the city of Pittsburgh at Point State Park. And you see men arrive here, as this would depict as February 17th, 1754. So as the Trent and then would arrive, he would begin sort of laying the square of the fort. Now, no official plans have actually been found, but on July 25th, 1753, originally the Ohio Company did in fact mention in a meeting that they had that they wanted the fort to be 90 feet square, 16 square feet bastions at the 4 points of this such polygon of fort, and hopefully make the walls 12 feet high. Now, they scratched the original plans of having this built about 3 miles down the Ohio from the city of Pittsburgh at the mouth of Chartiers Creek, mainly because Trent and the Half King would view the Forks and decide it was a better for this point here. But unfortunately, spies were also out by the French, and the French force had been sending out spies from Logstown, about 18 miles below the Forks, to sort of see what the English were doing. And as they see this, reports were coming in that the French were coming. In actuality, they were only right where Erie, Pennsylvania was at Fort Presque Isle on March the 8th. Really Trent sends repeated requests because of his 70, 80 men. Washington is yet to join him with his 100 or so men. And not really actually knowing to Trent, he actually realizes that Washington has only been able to get 25 or 30 men, saying it's been hard with the daily rate that he's been getting Virginia soldiers that nobody has been willing to join. So he's been delayed trying to get more people. So at this point, Trent is by himself with down at this point to 60 or 70 men. After they lay out the fort and begin an Indian treaty with the indigenous there. So Trent would meet eventually, hearing these reports and the alarm raised by the Six Nations that the French could be coming down to take such an area, even though the fort wasn't actually completed yet. So Trent meets with the two major components of the Six Nations, Half King and Menakatucha, and makes a defensive plan. He realizes that of the two buildings, as you can see in this wonderful painting by Nat Youngblood, a local Pittsburgh native, they had almost two storehouses built at the time, and then the fort sort of laid out with stakes. And they were eventually, the defensive plan was to hopefully lay two horizontal logs around the building, sort of build an entrenchment, and then eventually some upright stakes of palisades to do so. And Trent decides that in order to do so, or hopefully defend it against the French, he realizes he needs to hurry up Washington because he's heard no word from him. So he leaves the Forks. And on March 17th, 1754, he travels 10 days back through the mountains to hopefully arrive back at what was then the inhabitants, where Cumberland, Maryland is today, and in the vicinity of the Ohio Company warehouse across the river there, across the Potomac, to hurry up Washington. And unfortunately, Washington wasn't there. And today, this area where Washington would eventually encamp when he'd arrive is now the site of Emmanuel Episcopal Church, as you see in this photo right here. So back at the Forks of the Ohio, as Trent's there at the Ohio Company warehouse, on the night of April 16, 1754, and this is looking from the 31st Street Bridge in Pittsburgh, closer to Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, about 3 miles north of Pittsburgh. To the left there, you sort of see the Allegheny River right there, and then to the left, you see some smaller buildings there at the bottom of the screen, bottom left of the screen. And at that there, that's where the French would land at a village of Delaware called Chenopinstown. And at this, the French commandant, Claude Pierre Contrecoeur, would draft a summons. Now, Contrecoeur was a Canadian officer who had actually traveled with Pierre Joseph Saint-Laurent on their mission to bury lead plates and claim the Ohio country earlier in 1749. So he drafts a summons to hopefully evict Trent and his men, telling him that this land belongs to France because they claimed this earlier in 1749, traveling to this area and marking it with plates on the trees and buried in the embankments at every mouth of river and creek that were in the vicinity of this area. So Ward would write, because Ensign Ward was left in command that day as Trent would leave, with the notion that John Fraser, 8 miles at Turtle Creek, would in fact come down to the Forks, hopefully if needed. And as Ward would eventually go to John Fraser and ask him for aid, Fraser would refuse and say he had a shilling to lose for a penny to conduct his business with his partner, James Young, and he refuses to come down. So Ward is left by himself, and he's left with about 40 or so men, including the Six Nations, possibly about 50 men. And on the afternoon, Ward would write early afternoon, possibly just after 1 o'clock, on April 17, 1754, on the Allegheny side of their little outpost that they sort of started to build with the entrenchments and then eventually the upright stakes called palisades, the French come down the river. He sees the canoes and bateaus, and they land about, as he says, about 300 yards from the outpost, and they begin to unload pieces of artillery. And they do it sort of as like showboating or being bragging, because they want the English or those traders that are inside that palisaded entrenchment area outpost to see it. They claim to have about 9 pieces of artillery. And at this time, as they unload them, they also beat 2 drums to hopefully summon the men inside the palisades. Ward and the Half King would go out, and he would accept the summons, seeing that he was the temporary commander there at the Forks of the Ohio. Now, this is looking from, if the outpost was built, and looking up the Allegheny River. This is the modern day site. You can even see PNC Park there in sort of the corner of the sort of background of the bridge. This is looking up from the points of where the French would land today. And Ward would go out with the Half King, and the Half King's suggestion was to Ward to decline the summons and use a delay tactic, saying he'd rather wait for his actual commander to come join him. But unfortunately, Ward wasn't sure where even Trent was or when he was coming back to the Forks, but it was a delay tactic. And unfortunately, the French didn't buy it. The French refused to basically abide by what Ward's wishes were, and they basically gave him 1 hour to comply. They would say that the second in command of this expedition that landed at the Forks, Captain Mercier, would actually tell Ward he was 1 hour to comply, which at 2 o'clock, he looked at his watch and said he had till 3 o'clock, that they would have to either vacate the Forks or the French would use their artillery. So as they realized they take majority of that hour, Ward would actually go to them and reply in the summons that they would vacate the Forks the next morning. And so that night, the 50 men or so were permitted not to camp inside their palisaded outpost, but to about basically a few hundred yards away, within sort of earshot of the French camp, as of which Ward would dine with the French commandant Contrecoeur. And Contrecoeur would sort of ask him in questioning, which Ward pretty much was in the dark about, mainly because Trent had informed maybe the Half King of Manakatucha his plans of being a defensive and what they were doing, but he didn't imply Ward. So Ward would actually just say that he was no commander of rank to no such plans here at the Forks of the Ohio, and which the French commandant not only dined with him, but also asked him to purchase his tools, admiring the handiwork of the 2 storehouses that were built. And Ward declined, saying he loved his king and country too much to depart with them. So the next morning on April 18, 1754, Ward and the rest of Trent's men would head back to their little storehouse there built at Redstone Creek, about 35 miles back to modern day Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And at this time, they did barter and share. A trader, Hugh Crawford, is actually taken prisoner. Ward would not mention this in his deposition, neither would Trent, but eventually later on, a letter from James Byrd to Edward Shippen on April 29th, 1754 would actually imply that Hugh Crawford was taken on the morning of April 18th, probably as by the indigenous that were traveling with the French. And immediately as the Trent's men would leave, the French would begin dismantling the palisades and probably utilizing the extra timber. There would be a letter later on in May of 1754 that would actually say that they admired the handiwork of the English so much at the Forks of the Ohio that it is quite possible they used that lumber or type of structures to hopefully build their eventual fort known as Fort Duquesne. But also that thing is here, excuse me here. The French began to dismantle, and they would start hopefully laying out their plans to what they were building at the Forks of the Ohio. And like I said, it was the eventual Fort Duquesne. But the Half King and the Six Nations would stay behind. And he stormed greatly, as according to the account in his letter, that this fort or outpost that was built here didn't belong to the English, but in fact the indigenous here, the Six Nations. And in fact, when he angrily rushed at the French captain Le Mercier, he actually shoved the officer to the ground, declaring he laid the first log of the fort and he would protect anyone who defied against it. Of course, the French sort of paid him no mind, and the Half King would storm off and eventually would ride off, eventually, hopefully heading back to where he came from. But it was not without thing here that the tensions were starting to boil over, especially with the Half King. And Trent's men would eventually arrive back at the new store or the Ohio Company warehouse there in Frederick County, Virginia, and finally joined George Washington, who would eventually arrive almost around April 20 in 1754. And much to Washington's dismay, as he heard word of the Trent's men being evicted from the Forks of the Ohio by the French, he sort of laid a council of war on April the 23rd, 1754. But he also wanted to use Trent's men. And unfortunately, he would only pay them the daily rate he promised his Virginia soldiers. Trent, using the basically saying that the government had used me ill, basically later on July the 7th, 1754, because Trent and his men wished to be paid the 2 shillings a day that they were promised, that Trent had paid them already through the Ohio Company funds. And by refusing to do so, only about 2 or 3 would end up joining Washington's men. and which eventually Washington would head on to the Great Meadows and then eventually be defeated there on July 3rd, 1754, and surrender there on July 4th, 1754. And it would be in this letter that Trent said the government used me ill, which is why he or his men didn't join Washington at the Great Meadows there in modern day Farmington, Pennsylvania. So the question would be is what was the name of the fort that Trent tried to build to sort of conclude here? And it was suggested at one point in a letter on September 23rd, 1754, that it was to be named Fort Prince George, and that was the name that Robert Dinwiddie did. And it was also suggested by Charles Stotz, who sort of did an excellent architect from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh native, that wanted to hopefully build or construct these outposts from the 18th century to show what they look like today. And he named it or proposed it as a contemporary name, sort of as Trent's Fort. But there wasn't an actual official name. And going through research, the name was called Fort St. George. And this is the quote that it was found in. It's the only known reference to it, that it was from Thomas Cressup, another member of the Ohio Company, to James Tillman, another member of the Ohio Company, and also attorney at some points later on with the Ohio Company business. On May 20th, 1767, he talks about, in regard to Governor Dinwiddie paying Trent to be the commander of such a thing. And as he writes later on, not to read the whole thing, he would furnish them with provisions for that purpose as appears in the company books, charged to the governor of Virginia and the Fort St. George, so called in the company's books. So as we, conclude here, Ward would eventually plead his case on what happened there at the Forks of the Ohio. He would borrow a horse from Washington, ride to Williamsburg on May the 4th, 1754. But in addition, word had been sent out to all the colonies, especially the governors. And it reached Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Benjamin Franklin would eventually hear about this, Trent's men being, evicted from the Forks of the Ohio. And in a letter he wrote on May the 8th, 1754 to basically their liaison in England, Richard Partridge, on May the 8th, he would write a letter mentioning about being influenced by this surrender of Trent's men at the Forks of the Ohio. But in addition to this letter, at the very bottom, he'd said it inspired him to create an emblem to hopefully arouse the colonial union. And it was, as you can see, this disjointed snake with the names of the colonies on it, called Join or Die. And this, at one point, became the political cartoon that would sort of inspire and what Franklin would eventually use, hearing of the news of not only of Trent's men being evicted, but eventually of George Washington surrendering at the Great Meadows at the Battle of Fort Necessity in July of 1754. And so when he addressed the delegates at the Albany Conference, he brought forth this same influential cartoon that he published in the Pennsylvania Gazette on May the 9th, 1754. And it was eventually used to inspire the colonies to join together against the, foreign invaders that were coming from Canada. And eventually it would be used almost 20 years later or so to also inspire the American colonies to come together against the, at the time, Franklin called the tyrannical King George III. So as we can sort of conclude here, it's amazing that in this part here is early of 1754, spring of 1754, before Washington would be defeated in his only surrender in July of 1754. We can sort of say that what Trent did at the Forks of the Ohio, or modern day Pittsburgh, basically set the staging ground for not only the French Indian War here in the colonies, but globally in 1756 for the 7 Years' War. And we can also say that Franklin, inspired by hearing of Trent's men, eventually became influential in building the nation's first cartoon that was born in sort of here right in the city of Pittsburgh. And eventually, Pittsburgh being, and Western Pennsylvania being sort of the setting for what would become, as Winston Churchill would call it, America's First World War. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And just a reminder, if you have questions for Jason, to type them in using the Q&A button. Jason, I do have a question. Could you talk a bit about your process and the challenges involved in matching up historic resources, historic documents, and modern day geographical locations?
Sure. Yeah. You know, and it's funny because it is, I'm a big visual person when it comes to trying to find. I've spent countless, it's just as hard finding documents, let alone trying to find where these supposed sites are. And for me, I have to see the site and sort of walk the grounds, but base it on the, you know, primary sources. I figure these are the people that were there, and especially these surveyors like George Washington, William Trent, George Crowan, all these figures that are mentioned throughout history, knew what they were talking about. And it's amazing when you put it in as based on their you know, parameters that they sort of write in documents, and you compare it to, say, Google Maps. It's pretty accurate and in the vicinity, and it's comforting knowing, looking at these sites, going, wow, this was here, or this person said this here, or this letter was written here. And that's what gets me interested, and you know, it sort of gives me a feel when I'm researching and eventually writing for this book even.
Have you seen the account books? If so, was double entry ledger accounting used, debits, credits, offsetting, etc.?
Yes, the Ohio Company books especially, and it's a shame because the original, a lot of the books early on, especially the ones specifically that Trent had leading up to like that spring of 1754, from about February to April, unfortunately have actually never been found, and it's basically referenced in other letters. Now there are a few account ledgers of what the expenditures leading up to, of what they paid the men, the total of what they paid the commanders, and the supplies. Trent would write one on April the 8th, 1754. Not so much the double entries there, but most. So George Mason, who was the treasurer of the Ohio Company most of his life, would actually in his papers have the double entries and talk about what was, you know, purchased or utilized at the time. And that was the basis for what I used, hopefully, to show the expenditures and what was going on here when Trent traveled there.
Okay, at the moment, Jason, those are the questions we've got for you. I'll thank you very much for joining us. And if somebody's got a last minute question, now's the time to get it typed in. When we wrap, we're gonna take another break. We're gonna start with John McCurdy, our keynote, at 11:50, so in about 8 minutes from now. Again, thank you, Jason. And if you want to stop sharing, and John can put up his screen, and we'll be back at 11:50 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are back. And Jason, if you are available, we had a question come in just as we were going to break. So I'd like to share that question with you if you're available. And evidently Jason's not available at the moment. So I will ask Jason that question at the end of the next session then. I know we'll be going back a little bit, but that's all right. Our final presenter today is our keynote speaker, Dr. John McCurdy, on quartering the British Army in revolutionary America. In the decades before independence, British soldiers were a common sight in America. Locating accommodations for these troops aroused powerful debates in the colonies and forced the Americans to rethink the meaning of places like home, city, and empire. Quartering not only prompted calls for revolution, but inspired constitutional arguments for privacy and a reordering of military power in the new nation. Dr. John G. McCurdy is professor of history at Eastern Michigan University and the author of 2 books, including Quarters, The Accommodation of the British Army in the Coming of the American Revolution, which was named Book of the Year by the Journal of the American Revolution. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, John.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so great to be here. I really appreciate that. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So I first of all just want to thank everyone. It's just such an honor to be here and to be the keynote speaker. I'm humbled, truly. I've also really been enjoying the other papers I've been hearing, especially this morning, Jason and Alex's work. Very interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about how this research turns out. But finally, I have to thank Beth Hill and Rich Strum in particular for putting all this together in these uncertain times. The whole Fort Ticonderoga staff and quite a number of supporters. I'm so sad I can't be there in person because I really want to see Fort Ticonderoga. But maybe next year I'll be able to make it there in person. All right. In September 1756, Philadelphia received word that the British Army was headed to its city. The French and Indian War had just begun, and Great Britain had raised thousands of soldiers to fight France for control of North America. Throughout the summer of 1756, British and French armies had skirmished along Lake Champlain, but now that the weather had turned colder, the British Army retreated to the Atlantic coast. This way, the soldiers could winter in a protected place, allowing soldiers to recuperate and for the army to raise new recruits. In September 1756, Colonel Henry Bouquet prepared his regiment of 500 enlisted men and 47 officers to march to Philadelphia, where they would remain until April. But where would these troops be quartered? Colonel Bouquet's soldiers would need a place to live for up to 6 months. In 1756, Philadelphia had no permanent military infrastructure designed to accommodate so many men, no barracks or even a fort. Accordingly, alternative buildings would have to be located. Historically, troops looked to houses, domiciles that contained families, to quarter troops. There, the soldiers slept in whatever space they could find and often took their meals with the family, at the family table with the rest of the family. This was certainly the British Army's design for Philadelphia, as Bouquet's troops marched into the city. But Philadelphians wanted to keep British soldiers out of their houses. When colonial leaders first received word that the troops were heading to the capital of Pennsylvania, the provincial legislature passed a law directing that all British soldiers would be quartered in public houses or taverns and, quote, in no private houses whatsoever. Such a bold protection of the domicile had never been uttered before by an American legislature. However, the Assembly's stance against quartering troops in private homes did not go unchallenged. Pennsylvania Governor William Denny warned legislators that the British government would not look kindly upon telling the British Army where it could go, especially in the middle of a world war. Moreover, Denny worried that there would not be enough taverns in Philadelphia to hold all of the troops. In 1756, Philadelphia had about 15,000 inhabitants and about 117 licensed public houses, far less space than was needed to house a regiment of troops. But the Pennsylvania Assembly waved off these concerns. When the British Army arrived in December 1756, it quickly became apparent that Governor Denny had been right. Although most of the 547 soldiers squeezed into taverns, there was simply not enough space in these buildings for all of the troops. By Christmas, 62 men still lacked a place to sleep, so Governor Denny gave Colonel Bouquet a warrant to provide quarters for the soldiers in private houses. The Pennsylvania Assembly was outraged, declaring, "We cannot conceive it will, when well considered, be thought advisable to quarter the soldiers by force on private houses rather than by law on public houses." "The king's troops must be quartered," Denny responded. For the next 2 weeks, the governor and the assembly bickered back and forth without resolution, only an abundance of heat, passion, and rudeness, in the words of Benjamin Franklin. Ultimately, Governor Denny, the Pennsylvania legislature, and the British Army forged a compromise. With taverns inadequate to hold all of the troops, the assembly turned over the newly constructed Pennsylvania Hospital to the Army to use as quarters until the troops departed in April. In exchange, the British Army agreed to stay out of private residences. Histories of the American Revolution typically highlight the abuses of British soldiers. As colonists opposed British rule, London dispatched armies to crush the incipient rebellion. The clearest example of this is the Boston Massacre of 1770. But I want to emphasize that this is only half the story. For 30 years, British soldiers were a constant part of the American landscape, and they peacefully coexisted with the colonists. More than this, the colonists, like those in Philadelphia in 1756, wanted the troops in their cities. So how do we understand why this was and why it changed? Why was quartering a cause of the American Revolution? For my shameless plug here, my book Quarters, The Accommodation of the British Army and the Coming of the American Revolution seeks to answer these questions. First, I explain the Quartering Act, its background and its execution. But quartering was a bigger issue than one parliamentary law. Rather, the Quartering Act was part of a longer history that stretches back hundreds of years. Moreover, the Quartering Act applied to other parts of North America, not just those parts that became part of the United States. I think quartering also tells us something about changing ideas of military power. But my book is not just about quartering, it's also about ideas of place. Quartering was first and foremost a debate about the meaning of place. Scholars have written extensively on this topic, detailing the meaning we attach to certain places and how this meaning changes over time. The example of Philadelphia in 1756 is a good place to start. The people of Philadelphia were not opposed to British troops being in their city, and they weren't even opposed to providing them with a place to sleep and a place to eat. Rather, they only opposed allowing soldiers into their private homes. So why was this? What was it about the house as a place that Philadelphians felt was sacred, especially since they didn't seem to have the same feelings about taverns or public buildings like the Pennsylvania Hospital? Understanding place is vitally important to understanding quartering, because quartering was often a debate about where soldiers could go. Were they allowed in your house? And if not, why not? Moreover, if troops weren't going to be quartered in houses, then where would you quarter them? For many Americans in the 1750s, the answer was to build barracks. But this influenced cities that received the barracks. Some colonists asked why Britain was putting troops in their cities at all, rather than on the frontier or in Canada where the war was raging. Ultimately, this debate led to where troops could go. This debate about where troops could go became a debate about the American colonies as a place. Were they an equal part of the British Empire? And if not, should they remain part of the empire? In today's talk, I want to focus on three notions of place to get at this issue of quartering: the house, the empire, and the city. These three notions of place were not stable in the 1750s and 1760s. Rather, each were challenged and changed because of the debate about quartering. The results of these debates, I believe, can still be seen today. So we have to sort of go back a little bit here and talk about quartering. So what is quartering? Quartering is an essential task for any army. To maintain an effective fighting force, armies must secure campsites or buildings where troops can sleep, eat, and store their personal effects. Whether tents, houses, or barracks, quarters are essential to military readiness as weapons and discipline. Traditionally, quartering took place in any building that an army could get a hold of without regard for the building's function or inhabitants. Most of the time, this meant quartering took place in a house. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he forced his soldiers into the homes of Britons. When the English began establishing colonies in North America 600 years later, they repeated this practice. Now, the decision to quarter troops on domiciles was a practical one. Before 1700, there was very little differentiation between a house and any other building, especially in North America. Most people worked at home, and thus the distinction between public and private buildings that we take for granted really didn't exist. Most houses in the 17th century consisted of 2 rooms with an attic for storage. All manners of activities took place in these rooms, including manual labor, meal preparation, washing, prayers, and dining. In such houses, firm spatial divisions were impractical. Nor was the house particularly gendered. Although women were more likely to work where they lived than men, there was nothing particularly feminine about a home. Indeed, many taverns were run by women who ran their business out of their own home. Given the lack of domestic privacy, there was not anything particularly incongruous about quartering troops in houses before 1700. For the most part, quartering was an infrequent inconvenience for colonial Americans. Soldiers were forcibly quartered in colonial homes when the British invaded New Amsterdam in 1664, and quartering in houses was common in the colonial battles like King Philip's War in the 1670s. However, soldiers rarely lingered very long in colonial homes as they pushed their way to the frontier where they fought Native Americans or other European armies. This all changed with the French and Indian War. In 1754, Great Britain went to war with France for control of North America, and the British government dispatched thousands of soldiers to the colonies. Although most of these redcoats headed off to battle in Canada or Illinois, they wintered in the coastal cities. Beginning with the winter of 1756-57, British soldiers became a regular presence in Pennsylvania, New York, South Carolina, and New Jersey. Now, of all of these colonies, New Jersey was the least prepared to quarter British soldiers. In October 1756, when the 7 Years' War had just begun, 500 British soldiers descended upon the colony of New Jersey, spreading out across 6 towns and seizing quarters in whatever houses they could find. Particularly hard hit was Trenton. Joseph Yard told the New Jersey Assembly tales of harassment in his own home. According to Yard, a captain appeared at his doorstep and demanded rooms for soldiers. When Yard refused, the captain, quote, with musket in his hand, forced his way into the house and put in one of his soldiers. Although the soldier departed after only a few days, an officer soon appeared to quarter yet another man in Yard's house. Yard reported that said officer went into every room of his house and then ordered one of his sergeants to see that the soldier was lodged in a good feather bed. Now, Trenton in the 1750s was a small town consisting of about 130 houses at this time, few of which were not residences. On average, 6 to 8 people squeezed into each house, such that parents, children, and servants shared interior spaces. British soldiers joined the families in these small houses, sleeping in the columnist beds and taking their meals at the family dining table. Although the troops departed from Trenton in the spring of 1757, they returned the following November, once again demanding to be quartered for a second winter. Beginning in November, soldiers and officers of the 48th Regiment of Foot trickled into Trenton. By the end of the year, there were more than 200 redcoats living in the town. 250 more arrived between January and April of 1758. So many soldiers overwhelmed Trenton, crowding into nearly every house and spending at least one night in 121 of the city's 130 houses. Quartering in Trenton proceeded with little regard for a homeowner's religion, sex, or wealth. Some troops quartered with pacifist Quaker families and others with Presbyterians. 1/5 of the households where troops were quartered were headed by or owned outright by women. Some soldiers made themselves at home with the leading men of the county, like Dr. Ralph Norton and town treasurer Andrew Reed. The troops constantly moved in and out of Trenton, creating a destabilizing influence. 1 in 12 soldiers spent only one night in Trenton, but more than 100 lingered on for 5 months. Within the town, the troops were constantly on the move. One soldier who arrived in November stayed at Charles Axford's house for 3 months before going on to William Adams's house in February, before moving again to Joseph Hall's house in April. All of this is to say that Trenton's experience was typical of quartering in colonial America. When the army came to town, it lodged in houses with families. Now, although the inhabitants like Joseph Yard might not like this experience and might vigorously complain about it, there was very little they could do to stop it. However, Quartering had begun to change by the middle of the 18th century. In England, Parliament had begun to set some constraints on where soldiers could go. The Mutiny Act of 1689 ordered the troops only quarter in taverns, but never in homes. This introduced a legal distinction between public and private and designated domiciles as off limits to the army. Unfortunately, this Mutiny Act of 1689 and its protections did not apply to America. But even if it had, distinctions between public and private would have been impractical in America. Like Trenton, most American towns had only a few taverns, far less space than a regiment needed for quarters. And those few taverns often doubled as domiciles. But in America, the shape of the house had begun to change. As the building trades expanded and fashion switched, colonial elites replaced the two-room structures of their parents with two-story Georgian homes. Remunerative work was expelled from the home, while the bedroom became a place devoid of strangers. As visitors were detained on the first floor, the home was imagined as a place where vulnerable dependents like women and children were to be protected from the vagaries of life. Such new ideas made the notion of quartering troops in a house unconscionable. As a result, when the British Army arrived in America during the French and Indian War, people in the most populous cities sought alternative accommodations for quarters. Chief among these was Philadelphia. Much larger than Trenton, Philadelphia had the option of sending troops into taverns, and when this proved inadequate, colonial leaders sent them to the Pennsylvania Hospital, which is where we began. The other large American cities emulated this action. New York and Boston quartered soldiers in forts, while Charleston surrendered a school building for the soldiers. But this could not be a permanent solution. With the French and Indian War still raging, it dawned on most Americans that the struggles in Trenton and Philadelphia would become an annual occurrence, with hundreds of British soldiers quartering in their cities for months at a time. Accordingly, the colonists built barracks. Between 1756 and 1759, American colonists built massive barracks in the capital cities of New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, as well as in Albany, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and 5 New Jersey towns, including Trenton. This was a massive infrastructure project unrivaled in colonial history. By 1759, Americans had built rooms for 7,000 soldiers. Barracks were important because they allowed Americans to distinguish between public and private places for the first time. With barracks, Americans no longer had to lodge troops in their homes or sacrifice private businesses like taverns or public institutions like hospitals and schools. For this reason, I believe that barracks did more to introduce the notion of domestic privacy into America than anything else before the Revolution. But the barracks also had unintended consequences. When the French and the Indian War ended, the British government decided to leave 15 regiments of regular soldiers in North America to maintain order. With barracks in almost every major colonial city, it became easy for the British to station some of these troops in cities like New York and Albany, perhaps indefinitely. The American colonists were ambivalent about the continued presence of British soldiers among them. Although the troops no longer quartered in their homes, the army expected the colonists to keep the barracks in good repair and to keep the soldiers supplied. This created a financial burden that the colonists in New York quickly wearied of. In June 1764, inhabitants in Albany attacked a British barracks. Although the army was able to prevent a total destruction of the barracks, a mob returned a few days later and entirely stripped the guardhouse of every board. In New York City, Mayor John Kruger refused to provide firewood to the men of the 55th Regiment barracked in the city because there is no law to quarter soldiers. It being peacetime, Americans questioned why they had to pay for British troops. In response, General Thomas Gage devised the Quartering Act. Gage was commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, making him responsible for the thousands of British troops across North America. As Gage received reports of New York's intransigence, he asked the British government to write a law that would require the colonists to barrack and supply redcoats. Gage's request arrived in London in March 1765, and the cabinet hastily assembled a bill. In its original version, the Quartering Act noted that if soldiers could not otherwise be accommodated, then they would be quartered upon private houses. However, this attempt to insert troops back into the colonists' homes jeopardized the law. Parliament rejected the bill, objecting to quartering soldiers in private houses anywhere in the British Empire. Ultimately, it fell to Benjamin Franklin to craft a compromise. In 1765, Franklin was in London, serving as an agent for Pennsylvania, essentially a lobbyist. Franklin suggested that Parliament insert a prohibition against quartering troops in private houses into the bill. In exchange, the Americans would agree to maintain their barracks and keep them supplied with firewood, candles, blankets, and other necessities. This solution pleased everyone in London, and on May 15, 1765, King George III granted his assent to the Quartering Act. Now, this is the most interesting thing I think of my research, is that when I began my research, I was convinced that the Quartering Act shoved soldiers into people's houses. I can't imagine a better reason for revolution. Indeed, the Quartering Act often appears represented as it does in this comic. It's remembered as an example of British tyranny. But contrary to those perceptions, the Quartering Act did not force soldiers into Americans' houses. In fact, it did the opposite. The Quartering Act stated that when British troops arrived in an American colony, they were to be quartered in barracks. And should barracks not exist, then the soldiers would be placed in taverns or uninhabited buildings. This was a victory for the colonists, as it marked the first and only time that Parliament marked the only time that Parliament recognized a right to privacy in America. The price of the spatial victory was higher colonial taxes needed to maintain barracks and to purchase supplies for the troops. The passage of the Quartering Act invites us to examine a second place, empire. When the French and Indian War concluded in 1763, Britain's victory over France and Spain doubled the size of British territories in North America. For the first time, Britain's claims expanded beyond a strip of 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast to encompass all the lands east of the Mississippi River, including Canada, Florida, and the Great Lakes. With new land came new inhabitants as well, as an insistence from American colonists that they have a greater say in the government. Accordingly, a discussion began shortly after the end of the French and Indian War about ideas of rights and responsibilities. Essentially, the question became, were people outside of England entitled to the same rights and responsibilities as Britons or not? It might surprise you to learn that in 1765, the popular answer to this question was yes. A closer examination of the Quartering Act allows us to see why this was. The logic of the Quartering Act was that Americans had the same rights against quartering soldiers in their private homes that Britons had enjoyed since 1689. In exchange, the colonists had the commensurate obligations. That is, they had to support the military infrastructure, much like the inhabitants of the mother country did. However, this quickly fell apart in the implementation of the Quartering Act. By better understanding quartering, we can better comprehend the changing notion of empire and how this helped to usher in the American Revolutionary War. Indeed, the first attempt to enforce the Quartering Act was not in any of the 13 colonies that became the United States, but actually was in Quebec. In 1765, most British soldiers in North America were stationed in Quebec and Montreal. Quartering thousands of troops was depressingly expensive, and this cost fell entirely on the British Army. Accordingly, General Gage asked the new province of Quebec to implement the law. However, the Quartering Act was a poor fit for Canada. Most cities in Quebec lacked barracks common in New York and Philadelphia. Instead, the British troops that conquered Canada forced their way into domiciles. The most egregious example of this was Montreal. In 1765, there were still thousands of British soldiers in Montreal, nearly all of whom were quartered in private houses without the permission of the house owner or providing any compensation. Quebec Governor James Murray recognized that the Quartering Act made such practices illegal. Upon receiving word that the law had been approved by the king, Governor Murray ordered the army to vacate the private houses of Canadians and to find alternative lodgings. While this conformed to the law, it put the British Army in a difficult position. General Ralph Burton had neither the resources nor the authority to build barracks in Montreal, so the commanding officer of the British Army in Canada rented an unoccupied warehouse in the center of Montreal. But the building burned down before the troops could move in. This forced General Burton to go door to door, pleading with Canadians to quarter the soldiers. This time, Burton said the homeowners would receive cash for doing so. Now, most homeowners agreed, But 4 or 5 homeowners refused, and 27 British soldiers were turned out into the streets. One sergeant major found, quote, the door was purposely shut against him, and he was told they had no right to quarter, nor would they. Canada was the first stumbling block to the idea that the Quartering Act could unite the British Empire. Montrealers liked the rights of the Quartering Act, that is, that they liked that they didn't have to lodge troops in their private homes without their permission and without compensation. But Quebec was a poor province with very little tax revenue. The inhabitants were thus unable to comply with the law's commensurate responsibilities, specifically paying taxes to build barracks and to acquire supplies. Governor Murray offered to send bills for soldiers to the British Treasury, but this sat poorly with the British government, and Whitehall instructed Gage that the Quartering Act did not apply to Quebec. After the Quartering Act failed in Quebec, General Gage abandoned any attempt to enforce the statute in Canada, Florida, or the Western Territories. With the failure of the Quartering Act in Quebec, General Gage turned his attention to the American colonies. In the summer of 1766, Gage deployed 3 regiments from Canada and the Great Lakes to New York City, Philadelphia, and the New Jersey towns of Elizabeth and Perth Amboy. In compliance with the Quartering Act, the soldiers took up residence in the barracks and Gage dispatched requests for supplies to the colonial governments. Unlike Quebec, the American colonies had the infrastructure and resources to comply with the law. And unlike Quebec, the American colonies complied with the Quartering Act, at least in part. In Pennsylvania, the Colonial Assembly received the request for quarters without controversy, and in September 1766 allocated 4,000 pounds for quarters, firewood, candles, vinegar and salt, bedding, utensils for dressing victuals, and small beer. No objections followed in either the press or in the streets. The Quartering Act was simply not controversial in Pennsylvania. New Jersey, on the other hand, was a little more devious. Upon the arrival of troops in May 1766, the New Jersey Assembly approved an act for supplying barracks in the colony, although it later came out that this allocation did not supply items explicitly mandated by the Quartering Act, such as vinegar, salt, and alcohol. New York was even more intransigent. When the 46th Regiment entered the colony in May 1766, the New York Assembly insisted that it had always been ready and willing to comply with every requisition made, but then refused to supply salt, vinegar, or alcohol. New York Governor Sir Henry Moore accepted the Assembly's offer as better than nothing, although this response made the Assembly even more defiant. This defiance led Parliament to pass the New York Restraining Act in 1767. This law shut down the New York colonial legislature, until the representatives agreed to appropriate funds according to the Quartering Act. But these 3 distinct responses of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York belied the ideal of a unified British Empire. The Quartering Act had been designed to provide one set of rights and responsibilities, but only one of the 3 colonies complied with the letter of the law. But this was how the Quartering Act was ultimately enforced, in a haphazard fashion. Indeed, General Thomas Gage soon realized that receiving some supplies from the colonies was better than nothing, and he began to tolerate local variation. In December 1766, 2 companies of the Royal Artillery headed to Quebec were blown off course and landed at Boston. Although Massachusetts lawmakers did not include several articles prescribed by the Quartering Act, they nevertheless supplied the troops. South Carolina, likewise, would only vote quarters as were allowed by the troops in the year 1757, thus refusing to provide alcohol or to transport supplies. In both cases, General Gage accepted the inadequate colonial contributions without comment. By accepting local variation and pressuring the colonists, Gage successfully implemented the Quartering Act. Indeed, between the spring of 1767 and the fall of 1768, 8 colonies appropriated money for supplies and transportation for British regulars. As a result, the British government collected far more of the colonists' money under the Quartering Act than it ever did under the Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, or the Tea Act. However, by accepting local variation, General Gage also weakened Britain's hold on the American colonies. The Quartering Act had been designed to confer equal rights and responsibilities across the Atlantic, But the law's failure in Canada and its unequal application in the 13 American colonies meant that British law meant different things in different places. Quartering troops thus revealed an empire where Americans had greater liberties than Canadians, but fewer rights than Britons. It would be difficult to keep such an empire together. While the Quartering Act was successful from a financial point of view, it was also successful from a spatial one. Most importantly, the law effectively protected private homes from British soldiers. Time and again, the British Army complied with the Quartering Act by placing soldiers in barracks, taverns, or uninhabited buildings. This respect for domestic privacy helped to legitimate the law in the colonists' eyes and no doubt encouraged them to fund it. Indeed, this can lead us to look at a third example of place and how quartering impacted that, and that is the city. In February 1767, 2/3 of British troops in North America were stationed in cities. Redcoats were a constant presence in places like New York, Philadelphia, Perth Amboy, Elizabeth, and Charleston. The urban concentration of troops was largely a practical choice, as it was in the cities that barracks were located. In time, British troops changed the urban experience and prompted the American colonists to debate whether armed men belonged there or not. Histories of the American Revolution typically highlight the abuses of colonists by British soldiers, but violence and division are only part of the story. For 20 years, Redcoats were a permanent part of the American city, and they peacefully coexisted with the colonists. So how do we understand why this was and how it changed? Now, since the French and Indian War, the British soldiers had been a regular presence in Philadelphia. In 1757, the city constructed a massive barracks in the northern suburbs of Philadelphia. Built of wood, the Philadelphia barracks consisted of 2 parallel rows of rooms for enlisted men, joined on one end by an officer's lodgings. Plats of the city reveal that the barracks occupied an entire city block, and one English visitor wrote that he thought the structures could accommodate 17 or 1,800 men. Physically, the barracks were the dominant feature of the urban landscape. On a walk to the north side of Philadelphia in 1772, Sarah Eve was stunned by the size of the city's much better built barracks. Tellingly, she compared the Philadelphia barracks to an ill-looking hospital nearby, suggesting that not only did she perceive the barracks to be a public building, but she found them superior to others. While the barracks exteriors were comparable to civilian edifices, the interior was a decidedly martial place. Of course, this is not from the era. This is an image from Fort Niagara, but gives you an idea of what the interior of a barracks would have looked like. Enlisted men slept in berths, typically 2 to a bed. Barracks also contained a place for the soldiers to cook and eat their own meals. Barracked at Philadelphia, British officer Alexander McCurdy observed that the mess rooms at the barracks are something like Circe's cave, a reference to a mythological dark place, quote, out of which no man ever returned upon 2 pegs. Yet the soldiers were not alone. Wives and children joined their husbands in the barracks, sleeping in the berths with the men and sharing meals at the communal table. The Philadelphia barracks were located in the northern suburb of Northern Liberties, between about 2nd and 3rd Street near Spring Garden Street, if you're familiar with Philadelphia today. This was one of the poorest areas of the region, with a reputation for violence. The constant presence of soldiers in the neighborhood colored that neighborhood. Alexander McCurdy remembered how he and 4 or 5 other young officers would drink as hard as we can and then sally forth to serenade the women of the city. Prostitution and heavy drinking were rampant near the Philadelphia barracks. Yet the relationship between Philadelphians and the Redcoats was actually quite harmonious. When the 42nd Regiment withdrew from Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Gazette offered its thanks for that decorum and behavior which soldiers kept up during their stay in the barracks of the city. The troops set a good example, the paper noted, demonstrating that the most amiable behavior in civil life is not inconsistent with the character of a good soldier. And I would say the story is much the same in other American cities. New York used British troops to protect the nascent theater district. And I think I love the story the most. After the opening of a theater on John Street in December 1767, there were rumors that a mob of evangelicals might disrupt the opening performance at the theater. In response, General Gage dispatched a dozen men from the 16th Regiment to mount guard at 5 this evening at the Playhouse, and the performance proceeded without incident. I love this because it suggests that Broadway, as we know it today, is largely a result of the efforts of British soldiers in the 1760s. Charleston, South Carolina used members of the 60th Regiment as a night watch, while Perth Amboy, New Jersey requested the chaplain of the 26th Regiment to minister at the Anglican Church. In fact, the presence of soldiers in cities was not controversial until the British government decided to dispatch 4 regiments to Boston in late 1768. Boston was always more riotous than the rest of the American cities. Boston hosted the violent Stamp Act riots of 1765, and its local leaders, men like Samuel Adams, repeatedly challenged parliamentary laws like the New York Restraining Act. The people of Boston also prevented customs commissioners from collecting duties on goods imported to the colonies. In the fall of 1768, the British government had had enough of Boston's intransigence and dispatched 4 regiments to the city. Unlike the other American cities, Boston had no barracks. Since the French and Indian War, the city had refused to allow British troops into Boston, insisting instead that all soldiers remain on Castle Island in Boston Harbor. However, Castle Island was too small to hold 4 regiments, and so the troops entered the city. In compliance with the Quartering Act, the commanding officer requested that the columns provide accommodations for 1,500 soldiers. The Massachusetts Assembly received this request with incredulity. Not only did lawmakers refuse to provision the troops, they denounced the Quartering Act as proof that we can no longer be free representatives, nor our constituents free subjects. In response, the British Army encamped on Boston Common and seized the Massachusetts State House and Faneuil Hall for quarters. Unaccustomed to quartering British soldiers, Boston took the arrival of the troops poorly. Boston newspapers carried stories written by Samuel Adams and other members of a shadowy group known as the Sons of Liberty that documented the constant abuses of the civilians by British soldiers. Bostonians read about the insults and outrages of the drunken soldiery and how this fueled property destruction and robberies throughout the city. The arguments against the British troops in Boston were inherently spatial, as the Sons of Liberty insisted that there was no place in the city where colonists could be safe from soldiers. Many of the newspaper stories focused on women, painting them as helpless victims of the redcoats. One woman filed charges against a regular soldier for a violent attempt upon her, but a rape was prevented, while an inquest into the death of Sarah Johnson determined that she had been recently ravaged by soldiers unknown. Of course, once the British soldiers started raping women in the streets, there was little to keep them from invading the home. One evening in February 1769, 2 women received the solicitations and insult of a soldier on the street, but then when they ducked into a house, the soldier was so audacious as to enter with them. When the homeowner came to investigate, he was knocked senseless by the soldiers. To Bostonians, this verified the unhappy effects of quartering troops in this town. Boston's poor view of the British soldiers had a profoundly negative effect on the Quartering Act. Not only did Massachusetts refuse to pay for lodging and supplies, but the stories that came out of Boston reverberated throughout North America. In response to quartering in Boston, a riot broke out in New York City, and the colony's assembly vowed not to pay the least regard to the acts of Parliament. In South Carolina, the arrival of the 21st Regiment in Charleston resulted in an unusually harsh response from lawmakers. The regiment was supposed to be in St. Augustine, but delayed construction of barracks in Florida forced the regiment's diversion to South Carolina. Some Charlestonians wondered aloud about imperial duplicity, that this place will be further strengthened by another regiment from Florida. As a result, South Carolina refused to provide barrack supplies under the Quartering Act. Ultimately, the discursive conflict became physical. In December 1769, the New York legislature voted to appropriate £2,000 to supply the regiment in the colony. In response, the Sons of Liberty published a broadside denouncing the Quartering Act as unconstitutional. What makes the Assembly's granting this money the more grievous is that it goes to support of troops kept here, not to protect us, but to enslave us, the handbill wrote. Within days, violent confrontations broke out between soldiers and civilians in New York City in what became known as the Battle of Golden Hill. 6 weeks later, on March 5th, 1770, British troops killed 5 American colonists in the Boston Massacre. The violence in New York and Boston are remembered for mobilizing colonial opinion against British soldiers, but this dynamic played out spatially. Before the Boston Massacre, soldiers had been free to wander the city, but afterward this changed abruptly. In New York, General Gage ordered that no soldiers are to go out of their barracks off duty unless under the command of a non-commissioned officer. In Boston, the deaths of 5 colonists led local leaders to announce that it was not enough to confine the troops. The inhabitants and soldiery can no longer live together in safety, they announced, concluding that nothing could prevent further blood and carnage but the immediate removal of troops. In effect, the conflict had challenged the notion that soldiers and civilians could share the city. To be sure, the full transition was several years in the offing. 5 years would pass between the Boston Massacre and the first shots of the American Revolutionary War, and in this time the Quartering Act continued in force in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In late 1773, a division between Britons and Americans appeared again when a change in the tax on tea led to the Boston Tea Party. In response, the British government opted for harsh measures known as the Coercive Acts. As part of this new approach, London named General Thomas Gage as governor of Massachusetts and dispatched 4 regiments of British soldiers to Boston to once again occupy the city. The governor is making all kinds of warlike preparations, observed Abigail Adams, who lived in Boston at the time. She noted how Gage was mounting cannon upon Beacon Hill, digging entrenchments upon the Neck, planting cannon there, encamping a regiment there, throwing up breastworks, etc. But Gage feared rebellion, so he ordered regiments from across North America into Boston. As 5,000 redcoats occupied a city of only 16,000 civilians, Boston selectmen condemned Gage for reducing this metropolis in other respects to the state of a garrison. Parliament also revised the Quartering Act in 1774, although it did not invalidate the original statute's prohibition against quartering troops in private homes. However, the occupation of Boston drained what little support remained for supplying soldiers. In March 1774, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey appropriated funds under the Quartering Act for the last time. Thereafter, the law was occasionally cited by General Gage, but none of the 13 colonies, not even Pennsylvania, paid out money for barracks and supplies. In April 1775, events again came to a head when General Gage dispatched between 600 and 900 British regulars to march to Concord to seize colonial weapons. The troops quickly discovered colonists ready for battle. At Lexington early on the morning of April 19th, British soldiers faced a band of local militiamen and exchanged fire on the village green. When they reached Concord a few hours later, a second violent confrontation ensued. Hostilities are now commenced in this province, Gage observed 2 days later. The American Revolutionary War had begun. On July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress declared America's independence from Great Britain. In Thomas Jefferson's words, Congress included among its charges against King George III for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Now, this is such an interesting charge because it's very vague. The founders do not condemn the king for quartering soldiers in private houses, but the mere presence of British soldiers anywhere in America. Indeed, the Quartering Act had kept soldiers out of Americans' houses, but the Redcoats' presence in the cities had become a reason for the Americans to leave the British Empire. After the Revolution, the new US Congress insisted that quartering should not be resumed in the new nation. The Third Amendment to the US Constitution declared that no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Again, there's an interesting imprecision to this language. The amendment does not prevent quartering in private houses, but in any house. Famously, the Third Amendment is one of the few parts of the US Constitution never to have been the subject of a Supreme Court ruling. Since the American Revolution, quartering has simply not been an issue in the United States. Of course, this raises questions of why we should care about quartering and if I've just wasted the last 45 minutes of your time. While the Quartering Act may have had little relevance to constitutional law, I would suggest that the debates it inspired has had a profound impact on how we think about places like the home and the city in America today. The house as a place of domestic privacy has remained steadfast since the 1760s. Ideas of privacy have strengthened over time, emanating out from the home to the body. Indeed, exactly 200 years after the passage of the Quartering Act, the US Supreme Court recognized a right to privacy connected to issues of gender and sexuality. In Griswold v. Connecticut from 1965, the court granted married couples access to birth control on the grounds that the Third Amendment and other parts of the Constitution provide, quote, a penumbra where privacy is protected from governmental intrusion. The Griswold decision was the first time that the Supreme Court established that citizens have a right to privacy in their homes. In drawing on the Third Amendment, these decisions have enlarged the identity of the soldier to any agent of the state. Likewise, the penumbra of privacy has expanded from the home to the body. The Revolutionary War removed American colonies from the British Empire, and for the next 2 centuries, issues of quartering have continued to separate the United States from the rest of the Anglophonic world. We see this most clearly in opinions of barracks. The massive structures built in the 1750s were used by Americans in British armies during the Revolutionary War and then demolished. Philadelphia transformed its officers' quarters into a community center that stood until about 1880 and then demolished them. Today, if you go to the area between 2nd and 3rd Streets near Spring Garden Street, this is what you'll find. There is no evidence that there was once a massive barracks on this location. This is true of a lot of American cities. In fact, the only barracks built in an American city in the 1750s that continues to stand is, of course, the museum at Trenton, which is a great museum of the American Revolutionary War. But I find it interesting that as barracks have disappeared from American cities, they remained important in Britain and Canada after American independence. Indeed, barracks arose in London and across England in the 1790s, while Canadians built barracks in Halifax and Quebec that were used by active troops until World War II. Different opinions of barracks have in turn affected views of the city. Armies have only returned to American cities at moments of mass mobilization, like the Civil War. Although populations have grown up around military installations, the largest US cities continue to be devoid of military infrastructure and soldiers 2 centuries after the Quartering Act. Indeed, fears that the city will return to its previous existence reappear every time the country decries urban war zones, or when it watches nervously as National Guard troops confront violent protesters, such as in Chicago in 1968 or at Ferguson in 2014. Instead, statues and memorials to service members have replaced barracks and tents that once stood in public parks. In the end, quartering was far more important in the 20 years before the American Revolution than it has been at any time since. Yet the presence of British soldiers in places like Philadelphia and in the 1750s generated a discussion of place, the answers to which have proven surprisingly resilient since then. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have quite a few questions for you, so we'll start at the top. Why did General Braddock allow the Carlisle House, site of the April 1755 Alexandria Conference, to be seriously abused by his officers?
Wow, that's a very specific question. I'm not sure I have a great response for it. I mean, I would say let me see if I can stop screen sharing here. No, I can't. Okay. Stop share. There we go. Okay, sorry. I can't speak to Braddock. I mean, I would say that I mean, when Braddock heads out west, when he first arrives, he's really resistant about having troops in houses, and mostly wants to keep troops, out in out in frontier forts. In fact, from my research, the first great confrontation over quarters is actually as the colonists as the groups are returning after Braddock's defeat, as they stumble their way across Pennsylvania to be quartered for several months in Philadelphia before heading up to Albany. So I can't speak to the specific question about what Braddock's doing in that specific instance.
All right. Can you discuss any similarities or differences between the British soldiers quartered in North America in the 18th century and the quartering of English soldiers in the colonies of New York and Virginia in the 17th century, in particular in New Netherlands in 1664 after the English conquest?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So that is one that I can answer. So when Richard Nichols, Colonel Richard Nichols, arrives in 1664, he of course discovers there is no place to put the soldiers, and he has about 300 soldiers with him, English soldiers arriving, and they go right into people's houses, and it's actually an interesting sort of long dance that they do, because Nichols wants to, of course, appease the people who are there. He wants this to be an easy conquest of New Amsterdam. And of New Netherlands as a whole, and it leads to a long negotiation, and the people, the New Amsterdammers, do insist on certain protections of where soldiers shouldn't be allowed to go, and ultimately Nichols has to concede to this and agree to pay the people. So if soldiers go into their houses, even if they don't have a right, or even if the people don't have the right to say no, they are compensated. Eventually, this just becomes too expensive, and Nichols will send most of the troops out of New Amsterdam, scattering them across smaller cities, mostly in New Jersey, where there seem to be fewer complaints.
How rich are the records of these barracks in Albany, New York? Where and how many? I am aware that one supposed barrack off of the Delaware Turnpike became a private home known as Whitehall.
Okay, all right, that's fascinating. I don't know about the one that becomes a private home. I mean, my understanding is, where the barracks would be, basically there was a fort outside of Albany, about where the New York State Capitol stands today, more or less. There were two sets of barracks, from my understanding, outside of the fort. One was used as a hospital, one was used as regular barracks. But there were other series of military buildings sort of scattered across Albany. I've actually found trying to track this down very difficult. I've never made the trip to Albany to dig through the New York State archives, and maybe there's something there. But from the other research I've done, it's been very difficult. But Albany's fascinating in the story of barracks, because it's so, they are probably the most contentious of the American places when it comes to quartering soldiers, to the point where Gage has very little interest in ever having soldiers in Albany. New York, Philadelphia, even Charleston are much more complicit.
I see that Matt Cagle, our curator, just shared in the chat a resource to get more information about the Albany barracks. So thank you, Matt, for doing that. How did the application of the Quartering Act in Quebec compare with the former French practice of quartering soldiers in private houses in Montreal and Quebec City?
That's a great question, and I'm not going to have a great answer for you. I mean, the French do contemplate this issue, sort of a similar issue. So they are building a massive barracks. They do build a massive barracks in the capital city of Quebec, shortly before the French and Indian War. And I think pieces of this still remain in Quebec today. It gets turned into a hospital and then gets turned into several other things. The French, of course, they run into the same problem that the British do, which is they don't want to pay for barracks because they're expensive. And the colonists don't want to pay for them either. So they have a small fort in Montreal, but they don't have a massive barracks like they have in Quebec City, or like they have there that are later built in the American colonies. And I think, of course, there's some certainly pushback on the part of the French colonists once the British take over Canada, of saying this isn't our problem. Paying for the army is not our problem. We are a conquered people. And of course, there's something, strategic, if not tactical, in the British quartering troops in the conquered people's houses.
We had a couple people very interested in the map that you showed, showing the breakdown of quartering in the different colonies, and they are curious where they could access that map.
Okay, this is the one with North America and the different movement of troops. Yeah, so I found that actually at the Library of Congress website, loc.gov. This is, you can find the original of these at the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, and probably obviously at the Library of Congress, but the loc.gov website, if you go in and you search under maps, I think I ended up searching for North America, because those are from 2 different years. These are prepared and produced by the British Army, and they're pretty accurate. If you're familiar with John Shai's work from back in the 1960s, a lot of his information is taken from those maps. loc.gov.
This may be a bigger philosophical question than you want to tackle. Why was Boston less accepting of the British soldiers?
I mean, I think that's a great question. It's probably beyond my scope. I think you can make the culture argument, right? So these are the descendants of the Puritans. These are people who had always been skeptical of King. I've always been skeptical of England and Britain for 150 years before we get to the Revolution. I think that's certainly part of the story. I guess the thing I find so interesting is Boston's choice not to build barracks in the 1750s. In fact, the Massachusetts House of Representatives even contemplates this. There is a proposal made in the Massachusetts House of Representatives in the 1750s. We should build a barracks to hold 1,000 men, like every other city is doing, and that proposal never goes anywhere. And so I think, just looking at the perspective of space, which is a bit of a utilitarian argument, it is this problem of then when troops do show up, there's no place to put them. Whereas if they had sent 4 regiments to Philadelphia, Charleston, New York, they would have been fine. They would have been easily accommodated.
If soldiers were already housed in barracks, why does the Third Amendment talk about quartered in a house without the consent of the owner?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So, the Third Amendment's so weird, and I'm sure a constitutional scholar could do a better job of this than I can. But it's a weird amendment how it gets written. The Bill of Rights are largely written by Madison himself, looking over what exists in the state constitutions at the time. And there have been prohibitions in the earlier state constitutions before we get to the U.S. Constitution. Interesting to me, it's always states that don't have many soldiers in them during the Revolutionary War who are the most emphatic that soldiers cannot be quartered in houses, such as Maryland, whereas Pennsylvania, which has a lot of British troops in it and American troops during the war, seems to have no position on this until after the war is over. I think it's also interesting. So it's actually the Third Amendment is debated in Congress, debated in the House of Representatives before it's approved and then sent out to the states for ratification. And there's this strange amnesia that goes on. The people who are in favor of this amendment say, we need to do this. Look what happened in England. There were troops in people's houses, and others say, well, it's not that big of a deal. They seem to have no memory of this experience from the 1760s or even the war, which soldiers do wander into people's houses with some frequency during the American Revolutionary War. And so I'm always fascinated why that is. There's this sort of a historical amnesia. They want to go to an English context. But I think it gets added, with its imprecision because they want to be as broad as possible. But I also find the Third Amendment really interesting, right? So the Third Amendment is the only one of the Bill of Rights where there's an opt-out clause, basically, right? So you have the right to not have soldiers quartered in your house as long as it's peacetime and as long as Congress doesn't pass a law saying that soldiers can go into your house, right? So imagine how the Second Amendment or the First Amendment would look if those rights could be abrogated by an act of Congress, right? So the Third Amendment's a very strange creature.
So a couple folks have raised their hand. I just want to remind you that the way to ask a question is to type it in the Q&A button at the bottom. So if you would please do that, Leslie. Also, Lynn, I know that you weren't able to see Matt's link, so I will ask Matt to send that to me by email, and I'll forward it to you by email after the session today. Next question. Can you speak about the barracks built in Charlottesville after the Battle of Saratoga to house the POWs from that defeat?
Yeah, I really can't. It's interesting because there's even a city named Barracks, right, outside of Charlottesville. I can't speak to that. With my research, I kind of went up to the Revolutionary War and stopped. So I'm just going to opt out of that question.
All right. Generally speaking, how well did British soldiers behave when quartered in private homes?
So I think it's an interesting point. That is one thing we don't really have a lot of good evidence on, because of course, even with the Quartering Act, or even before, during the French and Indian War, colonists could of course choose to have troops in their houses for money, for status. When that happened, usually the soldiers that came into someone's house were officers. Officers hated staying in barracks. So they would pay to stay in a tavern, or they would stay in someone's house. Of course, they're largely going to be paying for that quartering out of their own pocket. But of course, officers are going to be older. They're going to be more refined. They're going to bring a certain reputation to the house, and they act very well. In terms of, the great fear is always enlisted men. The great story is always that the enlisted men are going to rape the women of the house, right? That is the great fear. I have not found the definitive evidence of where this is happening. There's a lot of threat of sexual violence, but cases of this I've never been able to get my hands on. That's not to say it doesn't exist. It just means I can't find the records. And again, once the war breaks out, during the 7 Years' War, especially under Loudon, right? There's a lot of complaints about quartering, and then of course during the Revolutionary War itself, during wartime, there are a series of great complaints.
All right. I'm thinking we're pretty much done with questions. Leslie said she accidentally hit the raise the hand, so she didn't actually have a question. And Andre Goose has posted 2 links. He found your 2 maps on the Library of Congress website and posted those links. So that's great. I did have a question from someone asking if there's any plans to turn your book into an audiobook.
If there is, I don't know about it. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, this is academic publishing, so I'm going to need about, probably sell about 20,000 more copies before that would happen. But yes.
All right, thank you, John. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I hope you have a great afternoon, and we will see you all again at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you soon.